on, Carly, please. All good? Yep.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the General Committee meeting.
Good morning.
I declare the meeting open. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, which is the Cubby Cubby or Gubby Gubby people, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We have no apologies for today, no presentations,
No.
Mr. CEO, no deputations. Nope. Councillor Glasgow has to go to a funeral this morning, and he has requested that we deal with item 7 on the General Committee agenda first, which is the Noosa Civic item. So if councillors have no objection to that, we'll...
I've got an objection to you referring it as the Noosa Civic item. It's actually the Shire Business Centre, not the Noosa Civic we're dealing with.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I stand corrected. It's the Shire Business Centre application. So any objections to that being moved to item 1? All right, we'll do that. So, welcome Kim, Kerry, Patrick and Connor. Councillor, do you have any questions for staff?
Goodness me, we have to get our brain around this change of agenda.
Just do we need to stand to ask questions?
Yeah.
No, you don't. Just
General
committee.
Just trying to get it right. Just to clarify, I know when we were talking about the
just before we start, councillors, I think there's a couple of councillors may have to have a conflict of interest.
Okay.
Here we go. I beg starting.
Thanks for pointing
I'm
that
at
out.
the top of the
Yeah,
page.
it's all over,
Yes.
it's all over the place.
So I declare a conflict of interest in the matter, as in 2009, prior to my election to the Sunshine Coast Council, I was a co-respondent with Sunshine Coast Council in an appeal against a refusal to expand the Noosa Civic Shopping Centre. The appeal was for a very different development application than the application currently before Council. I believe I can consider the matter impartially and in the public interest, and request to remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate and vote on the matter. Thank you.
Okay.
We're not having to stand up.
No.
We do one at a time.
We have
No,
to deal with them one at a time.
No, I think the appropriate process would be all the declarations be made, and then you deal with them one at a time, because by having all the declarations made determines who can deal with the other issues about whether they stay. So I think the councillors who have a conflict of interest should make those declarations, and then we work through them one at a time.
Okay, well, I'm second. I'd like to declare a perceived conflict of interest in this matter because prior to my election to council and during my time as honorary secretary of the Noosa Parks Association, I was signatory to a submission regarding an application on this site. I believe I can consider this item impartially and in the public interest, and request to remain in the meeting room to participate in debate and vote.
Your turn, Brian.
Yes, I would also like to declare a perceived conflict of interest as prior to my election to council and during my time as president of the Noosa Shire Residents and Ratepayers Association. I was signatory to a submission regarding an application on the site and made public statements regarding that application. I believe I can consider the matter impartially and in the public interest, and request to remain in the meeting room to participate in debate and vote on this matter.
So councillors, the appropriate process would be now to consider those, probably the logical way being the order that they were made. Those councillors who've made a conflict of interest declaration can't participate in that vote for your colleagues. So only the remaining 3 councillors, which is a quorum for this council, can consider those issues.
I might have to clarify some dates with regard to when the submission was made as to whether I was treasurer of the Noosa Residents Ratepayers Association at the time.
No.
Councillor Jurisic, you raised this last time, came up and determined that you didn't have a conflict of interest.
Thank you. I was just trying to remember, with Brian being president, I was just trying to remember.
Well, I'll move that Councillor Wellington has a perceived conflict of interest in the matter and may remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate and vote on this matter. May I have a second for that, please?
I'll second.
Second. As Councillor Wellington went to great pains to point out before, this is not the Noosa Civic application. It's a totally different application. So that's what I propose. All those in favour? Councillor Wellington may remain in the room. Thank you. Same for Councillor Jackson. I would move that Councillor Jackson has received conflict of interest and that she may remain in the meeting room to participate and debate and vote on this matter. May I have a seconder for that, please?
I'll second that.
Seconded Councillor Glasgow. Anyone wish to speak to the motion?
Yeah, just be careful with the statement that it's a completely different matter, Councillor. The Shire Business Centre as a whole was reviewed at the time, even though there were different master plans. I mean, yes, what's on the table here is an element of the original Noosa Shire Business Centre application. The shopping centre was one component of it. The entire Shire Business Centre may have been said. I wasn't privy to the actual debate at the time, but it may be that the elements of the Shire Business Centre were in this. So a broad statement stating that it's a completely different matter. Maybe a
different application,
different
I think is the
application.
word, not a different matter.
I said that's why I was clarifying the
different application.
language being used by the councillor.
So are you in favour of the motion that's before us?
I'm in favour of the
Councillor?
motion. Just be
Thank you.
careful
All
of
those in
the.
favour? Against? Motion's carried. We'll move on to the final one. I'd also like to move that a perceived conflict of interest on behalf of Councillor Stockwell, and that he may remain in the meeting room to participate in and the debate and vote on this matter. Can I have a seconder for that, please?
I'll second.
Seconded Councillor Lorikeet. Any councillors wish to speak to the motion? Put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Motion's carried. Thank you. All right, Councillor Lorikeet, you had some questions for staff?
Yeah. When we looked at this area with the Noosa plan in mind, we did take into consideration lot 21, but lots 17, 18 and 19 have still remain as high density residential.
That's good.
That's correct.
I thought we took them all off the table. That was the only question I had to clarify.
Okay. Well, I do have some questions,
Ingrid.
so I'll start. Perhaps start with. I understand the staff have put forward a recommendation to refuse the current application as it has been negotiated. I'm just wondering. As I understand it, there's some issues that are reasons for refusal, and it would appear to be in particular to do with the infrastructure agreement that was made in relationship to this land in 2003 and continues to be relevant because it goes with the land, that infrastructure agreement. Can you clarify for us what would need to change in order for this to become an approval?
There's two elements in the reasons for refusal. One is that the proposal has not met the environmental requirements specified by the Noosa plan or the state planning regulations and state planning policy. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, officers have been seeking an offset towards the koala habitat, but the applicant does not believe that that is payable, given land previously dedicated with stage 1 of the Noosa Business Centre. The second component that is in the reasons for refusal is conditions of approval require works external to the site, and council is stopped from conditioning those works under the existing infrastructure agreement. So to condition required works for bushfire in particular, but also pedestrian paths, would require a deed of variation to the existing infrastructure agreement. Mm-hmm. So just on that, if I may, after the agenda closed, we have received not a new infrastructure agreement, so not a deed of variation, but the applicant has forwarded through a new infrastructure agreement. We've only had a basic review of that infrastructure agreement, but it seeks to essentially outline at least some of the conditions that council is stopped from conditioning some of the works required.
So at this point, that's not on the table because we don't know what it is.
No, there's been no time for officers to review that.
And when did you
infrastructure
receive that infrastructure agreement?
Late last week. Yeah, late last week.
Late last week.
Councillor Wellington, you had a question?
Yeah, just for the sake of those who are unfamiliar with this situation, it might be useful, Kim or Kerry, if you explain why it is that it's being brought to this general committee now rather than staff continuing to negotiate with the developer. If you could talk to the deemed approval situation, please.
Yeah, sure. This application is code accessible under our planning scheme, and it therefore there's a specific time frame that if council don't make a decision under the Planning Act, code accessible applications go deemed approval. The decision making period on this application finishes on Friday, the 21st of February.
So if we don't make a decision on Thursday night, the application will be deemed to be approved.
That's correct.
Thank you.
With no condition.
With no conditions.
No, we have 10
Okay,
business days to draft conditions.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the conditions cannot change the development. It's approved as proposed.
So just to clarify, the applicant has forwarded more information which staff would like to assess and may go some way towards satisfying your concerns. Staff recommended an extension of the decision-making period to March 20 to allow them to do this. The applicant has refused, and that's why the matter is before us now.
That's correct. So staff did seek an extension to the time frame to allow discussions to continue with the applicant. The applicant has not agreed to that. They feel that a decision should now be made by council.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So may I just clarify in terms of order of events? We received as councillors and public the agenda on Thursday at 1:30. It appeared on the website. So is it that before that, because that's what was written in the report, the applicant did not wish to further extend? Is that decision to not further extend was made before that, but then the reception of a new infrastructure agreement draft was received after this was on the agenda?
Yeah, so officers requested that the applicant extend the decision period. I think it's in the report, but approximately 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, yeah.
Maybe a little bit longer. At that point, the applicant advised us no, they did not want to extend the decision period.
Yeah.
But they did seek to continue to want to discuss the infrastructure agreement with officers.
Until the 20.
Yeah, right up until the agenda. We were
until
continuing
the agenda.
to
but then the agenda got put out, and then you have received after that a new infrastructure agreement. And there's been no further discussion by yourself or them about extension of time frame in relationship to that.
No. Right up until last week, I was talking to the applicant and suggesting that we continue to extend the time frame, and the applicant's not willing to extend the time frame.
So as a councillor, I'm in a position of having in front of me a report, which I have read in great detail and believe I understand. I have met with yourself, Kerry, and Patrick. I have actually met also with, I believe others have met with the applicants. But there's something that we don't know, which is this additional document that has been put forward. So we're being asked to make a decision without knowing what's in that or whether that's actually going to solve the problem.
So the additional information has been provided last week. That information is in a new format. So we had been working with the applicant on a deed of variation to their existing infrastructure agreement. The existing infrastructure agreement was made in 2003, and it has particular requirements and conditions in it that limit council from conditioning external works to any future development. This application, as the layout as proposed, to work actually requires, to meet the requirements of bushfire and access, actually does require some additional external works. The applicant's been agreeable to those external works and agreeable to council amending with them. They proposed to amend the original infrastructure agreement to do a deed of variation and enshrine those external works. What came late last week was a new infrastructure agreement, not a deed of variation to the existing agreement. We haven't had a chance to review that, or haven't had our lawyer look at that at this stage. So it's new information, and I guess that's been quite. That's how this process has gone, I guess, over the last couple of months. There's continually been new information coming forward and needing to be reassessed. So again, that's new information. At that point, the report was on the agenda. The applicant was fully aware of the timeframes right up until the day before. I had advised them that the report's going. Is there anything you want to change? Is there anything, do you want to reconsider the timeframe? And they didn't. They agreed that it was time to bring the application to council.
I understand that. That was what they agreed. So our task today is to consider what is before us, but we cannot consider this additional infrastructure agreement that's been put forward. So we can only assume what we have in front of us. Yeah.
But just to clarify, staff have received more information which is listed in this report, apart from the infrastructure agreement.
No.
You still need time to assess?
We have just received a further infrastructure agreement from the applicant late last week.
Yeah.
So there's been no time to review that.
Yes.
I'm raising it today so the council is aware, but it's too late to take that into consideration. The applicant has not, have told us they have no agreement to extend the decision period, so there's no opportunity for council solicitor to review it or staff to review it.
Okay, thank you.
Joe, you've already asked your questions,
I wasn't asking a question. You go ahead.
Sorry. All right. So on that base, one would have to ask why, if you were negotiating a deed of variation to the original infrastructure agreement, a new infrastructure agreement would strike the table. Was that a typical thing that you get from a developer with regards to a whole new agreement being put forward when a variation is being considered?
Joe, I've done a few of these over the years. It's very unusual to get that change of direction at the last minute.
Thank you. The other thing is, with regard to timeframes, we discussed this in November with an extension to December. It's now February. I assume that the applicant has until this stage been willing to continue to renegotiate and extend those timeframes up until the 21st as is currently.
Yes.
Okay. Questions from the report that I've got. On page 40 of the report, it mentions under the new, halfway down, it says, under the new South East Queensland Koala Conservation Strategy 2019 to 2024 mapping, the Shire Business Centre site has no mapped koala habitat areas, but the northeastern portion of the lot is within a koala priority area. Can you do two things for me? One, define the difference between a koala priority area and a koala habitat area, explaining why it's in one and not in the other. And two, tell me what part of the northeastern portion, i.e. what lot numbers, do come under the koala priority area.
So if I can, perhaps if we look at a figure 1 on, look at,
what page is that?
well, on this,
32.
32, yeah.
32.
So yeah, so
Up on the screen, Council.
We'll put it up on the screen.
yeah, okay. So see up there on the top right hand side, lot 23. That is listed as or mapped as a koala priority area, but it doesn't contain any koala habitat area.
Not mapped.
Not mapped.
So
as
why
contained.
would it be listed as a koala priority area if there is no koala habitat?
Because then it goes to the fact that it's all about putting in place safe koala passage through that. I think it's just to do with its connectivity to the lot 147 there, which is a national park.
Even with regard, okay, because it doesn't go actually all the way to the road. Sorry.
Yeah, just answer. We don't understand the new state mapping around koala habitat. Council objected to the state mapping. Our investigation of the site says that is koala habitat on that triangular piece, lot 23, as well as the other portion of the site. So we're not quite sure of the logic that's been used or the rationale that's been applied by the state to map lot 23 as koala priority area, and the other areas as koala habitat. What it does mean under the new regulation, an area that's mapped as koala priority area and mapped as koala habitat means no clearing can occur and no offsets can be applied either.
For which one?
If it's mapped as both koala priority area
Yeah.
and koala habitat by the state, it means that there's no clearing permissible by the state regulations and no offset available as an option to the applicant.
And both those koala habitat area and koala priority area are state defined.
That's right.
Thank you. That's right, Claire. Next question. A little bit further down on page 40, specific outcome 01. On page, or starts at the end of page 40, environmental enhancement area or biodiversity overlay is protected from the impact of development by avoiding edge effects, and 2, avoiding fragmentation, and 3, maintaining vegetation in manageable and viable configurations. Doesn't the development do this by the requirement of a vegetated buffer around the entire site as currently exists on the existing developed areas? Isn't that the point of OS3?
No, well, it's not to our satisfaction. It really the OS3 is a visual buffer. That's its purpose under the master plan.
So under the original master plan, what was considered permissible for the master plan to go ahead that avoided fragmentation of koala habitat?
Well, it'd be all about, with the current proposal, in order to get the stormwater drainage to work, they're proposing clearing all the lots, all the lots in the southern portion to make them flow backwards. So that doesn't retain any vegetation on the lots, so there's no safe koala passage through the sites or anything like that. It's only around the periphery along Walter Hay Drive where Open Space 3 is concerned. That's that visual buffer.
But that's what I'm asking. In the original master plan, by my understanding, OS3 was the only koala connectivity that was provided.
It wasn't specifically for koalas. It was.
Was there any other koala connectivity provided?
Not specifically for koalas.
Thank you. That's where I was going to, Connor.
Yeah.
And the next question.
I think that's an important point to make, Joe, is the master plan started its inception in the late 90s, and there was Master Plan 1, Master Plan 2. So over time, koalas have, I guess,
gone from common
to more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been changes around planning legislation to ensure we protect koala habitat, to ensure the long-term survival of koalas.
So the length of time it's taken from the original planning to this stage of this plan to come, of this application to come to fruition, has meant that the state has implemented a number of changes, plus there would have been a planning scheme change in that time as well.
Yeah, that's right.
To move the goalpost, if you like, from the time that the master plan was created.
Yes, there was no state regulation when the master plans was done. That's right.
That was only in 2017, the state regulation?
No, it was
14.
The state regulations 2017, but there was other provisions around koala offsets which came in approximately 2008, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Jess.
Yes.
Hang on, I'm just trying to find my next question.
I'll just quickly jump in there. I just, at the start there when you talked about those contributions to stage 1A and 1, I'm just struggling, just clarify exactly what that is on the map. Can you bring that up please again, Colin? Just from my understanding, they're not prepared to pay in these stages 1 or 1A. What do you, I've never heard that before. We're talking about numbers and lot numbers and so forth. Is that?
I don't. I'm sorry.
You said in the beginning of the conversation before they didn't want to pay for the initial contributions.
Yeah, so since November, in the report to Council, officers reported that a contribution was payable, an offset for koala habitat. At that time, the applicant did not believe they should be required to pay that offset, and it's still their position that they should not be required to pay that offset.
And that's for the whole site then, just
for the whole
stage
site.
1 or 1A for the whole site.
Yeah.
Is Mr. Wellington?
I'm going to move the staff recommendation.
Okay. Seconded, Councillor Stockwell. Councillor Wellington.
Oh, you're going to speak. I actually hadn't finished asking all my questions.
Oh, there's a
at
big
all.
pause there. You're welcome to ask questions. I'm happy for
Well, you go ahead.
people to keep asking questions.
Okay, I certainly have a lot of questions,
Yeah,
but I've
sure.
been polite and let Joe go ahead.
That's right, I think I've got to the end of mine. I did just want to check that.
Jess, were you finished with yours? Can
Yeah,
I?
you guys first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
When I asked about the things that would need to change in the deed of variation, you mentioned you were seeking the offset, so I guess that's to do with koalas, and also the matters of the works that are required external to the site that need to be conditioned and cannot under the current infrastructure plan. I understand, though, that there's also some issue around infrastructure charges, because as I understand it, the infrastructure agreement says that the works that were completed by the then developer, which happens to be the same as the current applicant, were actually sufficient to cover off infrastructure charges, and therefore there would be no additional infrastructure charges charged later. Can we just clarify that and what the staff position is on this?
Yeah, so there's two elements in the current infrastructure agreement that was signed as part of stage 1 of the Shire Business Centre. One is that council cannot condition any further works external to the site, and that was included in the infrastructure agreement at the time, given the significant amount of works required and was constructed with Noosa Civic and the showrooms, stage 1 of the Shire Business Centre.
Sorry, can I just clarify what you mean external to the site would mean, like additional road works like the Eenie Creek Road or Walday Drive in the original?
Yes.
Correct. Thank you.
That's right. So not part of the lot.
Thank you.
The second component is that no further infrastructure charges or contributions are payable, providing the development continues to meet the intensity envisaged under Master Plan 2. So the infrastructure agreement would stop council imposing conditions for contributions or issuing an infrastructure charge where the intensity of development remains consistent with Master Plan 2.
And to clarify the concerns you have about this matter going forward?
That's the existing infrastructure agreement, which we have to all acknowledge. I guess the concerns that the report raises is the infrastructure agreement that we've reported to council, the one we had prior to finishing the report, proposed to change reference to Master Plan 2 to the draft planning scheme.
Who suggested this? Sorry?
The applicant.
Applicant in their deed of variation?
In their deed of variation proposed that.
Yeah.
So what that would mean is that if council were to have signed that deed of agreement, there would be no infrastructure charges able to be issued where future development remained consistent with the intensity allowed under the draft planning scheme. The concern raised there is the draft planning scheme allows for a greater level of development than the Master Plan 2.
Mm-hmm.
Officers have calculated that difference based on the gross floor area allowable and stormwater impervious area as based on the applicant's assumptions of how the development would proceed of being equivalent to around $4 million. But if that was based on the highest and best use of the site under the draft scheme, the amount would be $10 million the council would forgo if they entered into that deed of variation. So that deed of variation was not acceptable to officers. That seemed unreasonable and, in short, not a good deal for council and the community.
Can I just clarify this concept of foregoing charges? Given the infrastructure agreement already stated that it wouldn't be possible to charge any more infrastructure charges, and that's what we have now as an agreement, does that mean that if it were built to the density of MP2, we would also forego infrastructure charges. That has not been calculated into the 4 million and 10 million that you're talking
It
about?
has been, yes,
Oh,
that's right.
So how much of the 4 million and 10 million is actually what would have happened anyway?
No, that's the difference
That's the difference.
between Master Plan 2
Okay,
and
that
the
is
rough
the
planning
difference.
scheme. So,
MP2. Okay.
yeah, so if you like, we've applied a credit
Okay.
for development able to be
Yeah,
achieved under
and
the
it
Master
would have
Plan
been-
2.
Otherwise, it would have been even more.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Can I also ask about what was the actual work that the developer agreed to do at the time of the infrastructure agreement as a compensation for not having to pay offsets and pay for further infrastructure charges?
Yeah, so that's detailed on page 38 of the report for council. And there's some dot points there, and I can read those out for you. But dedication of 11 hectares of public open space, which runs along Eenie Creek. Duplication of Eenie Creek Road. Construction of Walter Hay Drive and extending to the motorway. And dedication of land for the construction of Walter Hay Drive and construction of a bike network. So it was considerable works, and at the time council felt that on balance I suspect that those works were reasonable, and to allow, in recognition of that, they signed the infrastructure agreement.
Mm-hmm. And so the amount of money, we don't know how much at the time was spent, but considerable is the word for it. It's quite a large amount of money was paid. Council didn't have to spend money on any of this?
No.
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 And in fact, open space was dedicated, which is still dedicated now.
Yeah.
11 hectares. Yeah.
That's correct.
There's considerable works.
Was
I
there,
mean,
was
the
there a
development.
calculation of the value of those contributions at the time, and an equivalent contribution calculation?
I don't know, Joe.
Yeah, look, I can't recall off the top of my head, Joe. I was here at the time, I just can't recall.
I'm sure there would have been, but
And that hasn't been, nobody's been able to come up with a figure that.
No.
that
No.
So if we would have just quickly, just for argument's sake, at that time, these infrastructure agreement paid and it done, just like we've done it in 2003, and just to say, in the next 12 to 24 months, it would have just continued with the development as it is today, none of these extra charges would have come on board, is that right? Because we wouldn't have had a new plan in place, we still would have been going to MP2, is that correct?
Yes, so the infrastructure agreement continues on, and there'll be no charges payable where it remained consistent with MP2. The draft scheme, though, allows a higher density, so once we reach that ceiling of MP2, there'll be charges issued for future development on any lots.
We're asking them not to construct as per the draft planning scheme. We're asking them to disregard that, aren't we? And just make things as MP2.
No. We're, in terms of the subdivision, we're asking the subdivision to comply with the current scheme, but also give consideration to the new scheme, the draft scheme.
I swear there was some wording somewhere when we were meeting at it, we said disregard any.
That was from the deed of variation to remove that wording from the proposed deed of variation.
A clause there about disregard any thought into the new planning scheme. So, but in essence, Dave, because we've adopted this new town planning scheme, we're building to that. This is the difference in terms. So we're basically asking them to pay twice, aren't we? In essence.
No.
So they haven't paid the first time then.
No, they built, yes, a considerable amount of works, which is recognised by the current infrastructure agreement. The works, though, were also required to make the site function, to give access to the site. Going forward, we're saying that it's an old infrastructure agreement, there's new planning requirements around koala habitat and environmental matters, and you need to look at complying with those requirements.
Is this common that developments take 17 years to do this? Is it like a force?
Absolutely, I know developments have gone longer than this. Springfield was a good example where I was involved in that in 1990 something, and it's still going. So some of those long-term infrastructure agreements go 20, 30 years.
Particularly large projects.
Correct.
Or would be an example of that to the south.
or it'd be kicking that off now.
So just one more little one, Ingrid. So I kind of see it as, I think you've mentioned too, Kim, that basically all the technical stuff, tick, done, put it in a box, do it. It's the external stuff that we can argue over as infrastructure charges and pay this, pay that, but the actual zoning and the land use of the subdivisions, tick, put in a box, done that. They're ready to go with the technical stuff. It's just this little bits and bobs, koala, offset this, not there, koala tree there, not there, all this stuff. It's this side stuff on is this going to be stand up in court, you think? Because this initially could end up in quite a big court battle, which I know we win a lot of, and we're very proactive and challenging and winning, I agree. But
so, Jess, is your question, is this going to court?
Well, if it ends up in court, is this something tangible that we can defend?
So the issue here is that the subdivision has met a lot of the technical matters. So they have addressed stormwater, they have addressed bushfire, they have addressed the traffic issues, they have addressed the lot sizes, all those issues that were raised in the last report.
Which is basically everything. They've addressed
no.
They've addressed the land use, everything.
What they have not addressed is environmental matters. Okay, so they have not addressed the environmental matters that the scheme and the state requirements call up. So that is quite a significant issue. Now, it's not exactly the same, but council has just won an appeal around a subdivision on 2 David Low Way that was refused for vegetation reasons, and so council's planning scheme stood up in that appeal. So I would suggest we will have quite a strong case if the matter proceeds to court.
May I ask whether 2 David Low Way...
I would be hopeful, though, that we would not have to go to trial, and that if the matter is refused on Thursday, that discussions could continue and we would work towards a solution.
I just want to ask a question in relationship to 2 David Low Way. You said it may not be the same. Would 2 David Low Way be anywhere near being a major business centre in the SEQ plan and in the Noosa plan?
No, it's a different type of application, but the principles in terms of relying on the environmental issues for refusal are probably the similar issue.
Question, have I misread the report? There's still some concerns about emergency access?
The emergency access has been included because they are works that cannot be conditioned by an approval. They have to be in an infrastructure agreement.
Okay.
And formulate part of a variation.
That's right. And the applicants indicated they're agreeable to putting those in an infrastructure agreement.
And what are your concerns about the timing of the installation of acoustic fencing? Is there a disagreement about that still?
There's disagreement over the acoustic report and timing. The applicant feels the acoustic measures could be implemented as part of future material change of use applications for unit developments on those lots. Officers don't agree with that position. The acoustic matters need to be addressed as part of the lot reconfig, because the solution required will be an acoustic fence that has to go across several lots and potentially will have different landowners. So that matter has to be addressed now. And the other element with that is there's likely to be, there is noise issues coming from the loading dock and mechanical equipment on the shopping centre that needs to be further mitigated. That cannot be done as a future application for a unit development on block because it would be on a separate parcel. So it needs to be addressed as part of the lot reconfig.
So is this an example of something you'd like to continue negotiating with the applicant about?
Yes.
Prior to a final decision?
Yes, I think that's something we can resolve.
Just to clarify on that, the reason with regards to units, lots 17, 18 and 19 is because they are 3 separate lots and they could have 3 separate owners, requiring that noise barriers are put in place at this stage, regardless of the fact that each development may be quite different and the type of noise abatement required and the distances, the setbacks and all the rest of it may be quite different. Yeah. To me, I can see what you're trying to say, but to me the fact that each development could be quite different could mean a different set of requirements of noise standards and noise abatement. So why would you need that up front?
Yeah, the issue is exactly what you said, is because potentially there will be future different lot owners, and an acoustic fence only works if it's continuous across all lots. There's still likely to be future requirements on those residential lots individually as part of the MCU. They're going to have to design them to address noise. But the acoustic fence will serve a purpose for open space areas outside the building themselves. So that's important that it's addressed as part of the lot reconfig.
Thank you.
So I have another question in relationship to the Environmental Offsets Act, section 14.14.2, which appears to state that council could not impose payments of offsets for a matter twice. And as I understand it, the infrastructure agreement took into consideration offsets, and that the agreement was that the works that were already completed at great expense by the then developer or applicant would cover all that. So how is it that under Environment Offsets Act 14.2, council is now wanting to impose further koala offsets?
Well, I don't agree with that position. So the open space land was dedicated at a time there was no offsets required. The provisions around offsets for koalas started after the infrastructure agreement. So I don't agree that council would be taking a contribution twice. This would be the first time we've taken an offset for koala contributions.
So what the infrastructure agreement at the moment doesn't have anything about, it has wording around payments, but not around offsets specifically. It doesn't require.
The infrastructure agreement prevents council from conditioning the offset. We can't impose a condition on the approval. That's all. That's what it does.
That's what it does.
It also says we can't ask for any more land to be dedicated as open space. It also does that.
Right. Okay. Right. I have another question in relation to the fact that today is a general committee meeting and Thursday we have a ordinary meeting, and you are you have been in receipt of a alternate infrastructure agreement, which we don't know what is in it. Is there some information, would it be possible to assess that for the Thursday's ordinary meeting so that the decision of council could take that into consideration?
We can ask council's planning solicitor to review the infrastructure agreement. I'd suggest so. The time frame is too short for us to properly consider it.
Are there any options for further negotiating a deferral? Because it just seems rather odd to be sitting on this.
I'll answer that. The two alternatives. One would have been good to have a copy of the infrastructure agreement, or the alternative infrastructure agreement, put forward by the developer earlier than the end of last week.
Well, okay, but here we are.
And the second is that if the developer had extended the time, it would have given us more time to do it as well. But they're not agreeing to extend the time beyond Friday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you have asked them, since you received the infrastructure agreement, to extend the time?
Oh, no, we haven't asked them to extend the time again, but we have asked them on
Previously.
numerous occasions, right up until the agenda closed, to extend the time, because this was evolving. This was every day there was contact. So it was evolving right up until the agenda closed. So they knew of our desire to get an extension to the time frame, but we're not willing to extend the time frame. And as I mentioned in the beginning, decision is due on Friday, and if council doesn't have a decision, then it's a deemed approval.
Any more questions, councillors?
I think I've asked all my questions. We
can always ask as the debate continues. Councillor Wellington, would you like to speak to the motion?
Sure. One of the more salient reasons for refusing the application at this stage, as I see it, is the potential impost on ratepayers. Staff and the applicant have been unable, unfortunately, to agree to a deed of variation on the infrastructure charges, as we've heard. And the applicant erroneously argues that the intensity of the development proposed, which aligns somewhat with our current and draft planning schemes, is no greater in intensity than that was contemplated at the time of the old Master Plan 2, and therefore that the infrastructure agreement that would be associated with that very different approach would be no different in their assessment. However, a review of the intensity has found that it is considerably more in the draft scheme and also in the application before us. As a result, If the differences aren't factored in into the deed of variation, Noosa Council and therefore Noosa ratepayers could be foregoing between $4 million and $10 million in terms of lost infrastructure charges. And I'm not at this point in time prepared to approve a development application that it's in its approach to infrastructure charge agreements potentially robs ratepayers of millions of dollars. Of course, on top of that, as it stands, the application doesn't satisfactorily address the draft scheme's objectives with regard to vegetation protection, nor minimising or compensating for the impact of koalas, and others may wish to speak more about that. But there are other issues at stake here too. There are issues such as the poor connectivity for pedestrians and bicycles, failure to adequately deal with noise amenity for the residential lots, etc. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that in keeping with what I consider to be the bare scorched earth approach of the existing Noosa Civic, with its acres of bakingly hot bitumen and soulless buildings that ignore their surroundings, the application before us again arguably wants to take Noosa in that direction without taking Noosa aesthetics into account. It does this arguably because it doesn't succeed in retaining enough existing vegetation to create what it is that we've been envisaging in the draft planning scheme, and that is a new village in a park-like setting. And until I see some suggestion that that notion is really being addressed, then I do have concerns. But I come back to my original point, and that is that I'm not prepared to support a subdivision that has potentially enormous financial benefits to the landowner by allowing significant upzoning of the land, which is what's happening here. The land is being upzoned, so it has far more value. It is also a more intense development than at the time of the master plan too. And that potentially means that ratepayers will be out of pocket due to insufficient infrastructure charges and contributions being paid. Councillor Gladstone referred to this as little bibs and bobs, but I wouldn't call $4 to $10 million worth of ratepayer lost income as little bibs and bobs.
I'd like to ask a question actually. Councillor Millington just referred to the loss of vegetation as a result of this subdivision. I'm a little unclear, and I would like an explanation of, as this is merely a subdivision application, which I believe subdivides lots, but it's not a development application. Is it really at the subdivision point that it has an impact on the vegetation, or is it really at the developer, when those lots come again back to us as development applications, that really is when it all cuts in?
It's at both, really. So the subdivision on page 9.
It won't be 9. It'll be
Figure 5.
I'll just find it.
36, page 36.
Oh yeah, okay, green things.
On page 36, there's a plan that shows the clearing plan for the subdivision. Okay, so that shows you what would be cleared as part of the subdivision initially. So that includes obviously the areas for roads and services, as well as a fair bit of, substantial clearing for lots 10 to 15 in order to achieve stormwater management design. And obviously then as lots 3 and 7 would be developed, there'd be further clearing occurring, and lot 23 and 21, etc. What I would expect to see to achieve a park-like setting as part of a subdivision is areas that were identified for retention as part of the subdivision, as well as ongoing future development. So there's been limited areas by the applicant in identifying that. Identifying areas that would be retained in a long-term basis, trees, and that plan on figure 5 shows you that. Those areas on the roundabout in front of lots 6, 10 and 9 are green, so they're indicated to be retained vegetation, which is fairly minimal. See the small strip across the front, and the other areas marked as pink on the plans are areas that the applicant would seek to revegetate as part of the subdivision. They're fairly limited areas, I'd suggest, in terms of achieving a park-like setting.
So as a councillor, I've been involved in having input to the new Noosa plan, and I share Councillor Wellington's excitement about what the plan intends, which is a Shire business centre with a mixture of residential, commercial,
point of order,
retail.
she's talking about what she approves and doesn't approve,
Okay,
which
I'm
sounds a bit
asking
like
a
an
question.
argument.
I am actually asking a question. I was just being polite to you, but anyway, whether I agree with him or not is irrelevant. What I'm confused about is the statement that the big car park and the big concrete. I don't understand this, because everything we've been looking at for the new Noosa plan appears to have the need for development here in all sorts of forms, including roads and all this, and buildings. And I'm really confused about how we can develop a Shire business centre, which is defined as a major centre in the SEQ plan, without, and expect somehow it will be a parkland. I really don't understand where we are on this. I mean, this is a major business centre, so how can we be demanding it stay a park?
What the scheme says, both the current and the draft scheme, is it seeks a park-like setting. So to achieve that, I'm not suggesting the whole site remain vegetated. Certainly it needs a substantial need to be cleared to allow the Shire Business Centre to proceed. But I would expect stands of vegetation to be retained around the site to give that impression that it's set in a park-like setting. Now the covenants around the outside go to that partly, but I'd also expect stands in amongst development to achieve that park-like setting.
So Kerry, in this drawing that we're looking at right now, the stands you're referring to, are they the little chains of greenery? So you can expect that lots will be cleared in order to build buildings.
That's right.
But it's the little chains that you're concerned about.
Well, that's
here.
the applicant's proposal of how they will achieve the park-like
that's
setting.
acceptable, that sort of approach.
I'd suggest that they actually need to include a greater area to achieve a park-like setting.
Right. Greater area meaning wider
areas
for each lot.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Stockwell.
Oh yes. I think first off, I think we should thank both our staff and the applicant, because in the time since we last debated this in December, there has been a lot of good negotiation in good faith, and as the report notes, we have really resolved a whole lot of the technical issues around civil engineering, around stormwater management, around bushfire management, and it appears to me that they're the technical issues where we now agree. There is two substantive areas where we haven't been able to gain agreement at this stage. The first substantive area is around how this development approval will reflect the enhanced development potential that is afforded to these blocks as a result of the new plan. And as the Mayor has outlined, this is a significant, or I should rephrase, this is the most significant increased development in the Shire as a result of the new planning scheme. And it would be a great tragedy for this community if we walked away from their long-held view that developers need to pay the way for the enhanced infrastructure required as a result of increased development potential. In the report, we can see there's a variation between $4 and $10 million, and then as time goes on, that will be resolved as to what is the highest and best use of these sites, and therefore what is the correct infrastructure charge. But we know, as a result of what this council has decided to improve the development potential of this site, that there will be increased demands on community infrastructure. Each budget time we come here and we look at things of how do we increase the district scale sporting facilities, how do we improve the district scale parks, not just the roads, not just the stormwater management system external to the site. We know that we want to increase bike networks. Trunk infrastructure like that is funded out of development charges. So that's the one key area. And it may be that we're moving closer. We don't know what's in the suggested new infrastructure agreement, but that is a non-negotiable for me. If we increase development potential in the ability to charge for infrastructure charges for that increased development potential is non-negotiable. The second one is about the ability to claim environmental offsites. Now we do know and we accept that the site has a long-term commitment for development. We do know the infrastructure agreement as it stands was written before koala offsets came into place and before it became a vulnerable species. But we can be realistic and say that yes, a significant portion of the Shire Business Centre will need to be cleared. But our community will demand that we do all that is legislatively possible to get the best outcome for koalas. And in this case, our existing and our planned new scheme both say the same thing. Where clearing is unavoidable, then that clearing should be offset. We are prevented from just conditioning this under the existing infrastructure agreement. We know that there's a difference in legal opinion between our legal advice and the legal advice provided by the applicant. So it's coming down, I think, to two simple points. Both those points resolve around legal argument. It's not going to resolve around argument around this table. And unfortunately, in this case, making a decision is probably going to lead to a development decision or a development approval of some sort quicker than if we just seek to go around the table here. So while the legal process is unfortunate to me, as staff have indicated, it may be that once we get into that environment that these two issues can be resolved and the development will proceed. But at this stage, I'm not willing to support it until the realistic expectations of this community are met.
Thank you, Councillor Stockwell.
Yeah, I would actually like to, well, I'm going to check with the CEO on this one, but I believe I would like to move a deferral until the ordinary meeting in hopes that the staff can give us an indication of what the content of this revised infrastructure agreement is. I feel at this point it makes it difficult to make an informed decision without that information. That's a reasonable approach?
There is a motion that you can use to defer a matter to a later meeting, and that would be, Kylie will probably have the wording up before I even look it up. It's a procedural motion to defer, and
we can ask it stays on the table as well.
no, staying on the table relates to this
Only
meeting.
the meeting.
Deferring it is to another meeting. So it would be that the motion be deferred to, and you specify the date and time, which would be the Thursday council meeting,
20th.
if that's what the meeting decided.
So given that we don't make decisions today, we're deferring discussion.
You're deferring consideration of the matter. That's what I think Councillor Jackson's
Well, I
asking.
guess that's different, so we wouldn't vote on the matter at this meeting
What
at
you'd-
this point.
So what you'd be doing is, if this procedural motion was moved and seconded, and if it was passed, then this meeting would stop considering this matter, and you would then consider it on Thursday night. That's the effect of a procedural motion to defer to Thursday night.
This is in relation to this new infrastructure agreement that we haven't been privy to yet, and we'll get that tomorrow, obviously, or tonight.
So the pivotal point is, as Jess said, is councillors gaining an understanding of the content of the infrastructure agreement and its implications for this application. Will it be able to change the recommendation and then his recommendation for refusal?
Look, officers have had a preliminary review of the infrastructure agreement to know what's in it. The infrastructure agreement limits its content to only the matters relating to conditioning works. So it still does not include an offset for koala habitat, but it has requirements around works. So as I said before, it's a very short time frame to have the matter reviewed by council, solicitor and officers, so I'm not sure we'll have the answers for you, but we could at least tell you what's in it.
You can tell us what's in it by Thursday night, and which could happen if we don't defer the motion to matter today anyway.
The infrastructure agreement can be provided to council after this meeting,
Yeah.
what we won't have at that time is our assessment and our legal review. But councillors, I can circulate that.
So a legal review of the infrastructure agreement and its implications for ratepayers and the council won't be provided by Thursday night.
Well, our solicitor is very busy at
Yes,
the moment.
that's
we were trying to get some review on some other matters late last week.
Yeah.
And very busy. So we can only make the requests that he starts looking at this and we get the information we can. But as Kerry said, we've had a preliminary look at it. It does provide for the conditioning of the works, which we'd outlined, but it doesn't deal with the environmental issue, so that's still going to be on the table. Yeah. And also it changes the structure of, it was a deed of variation to the original IA, it's now a new IA.
Yeah.
We have not considered what that means.
Okay.
And that needs legal review.
Question?
Yeah.
Good question.
So could you please just make very clear, if we defer a decision to Thursday night, you will not be able to provide a complete analysis of the infrastructure agreement that you were handed at the end of last week. Is that correct?
That's subject to our legal, our
Because
lawyer, so I can't commit on his behalf. Absolutely.
Legal input.
Absolutely.
So, and secondly, if it were to be refused on Thursday night, the application, regardless of this deferral, that doesn't prevent you analysing the new infrastructure agreement and continuing to negotiate with the applicant.
No, that doesn't. Part of any process of decision, an applicant can appeal that. So then we're in a negotiation process anyway. So I would anticipate that this would continue on.
The issue for the council is that time's not our friend at the moment. We've got this situation because we need to make a decision this week, and the landscape in terms of what the developer has proposed in terms of the infrastructure agreement has changed and keeps changing over the period. So ultimately we need to make a decision on Thursday, whether we like it or not.
But on that question about the engagement will start as soon as if it's refused on Thursday night and it goes on, as soon as that engagement starts, say Friday morning with the developer, is that as simple as between staff and the developer, or is it straight into lawyer ping pong because they're appealing it?
The applicant will need to lodge an appeal to protect their position, so I'd expect that they will do so and they will seek some legal advice. The appeal notice sets out their grounds, and it means both parties will probably receive a little bit more legal advice, which I would hope would facilitate ongoing discussions and negotiations.
And I'd be more hopeful now than I would have been last December that if there was an appeal we'd be able to negotiate the outstanding issues. I think the volume of issues we had when we first looked at this matter, was that December or November? October, gosh, time flies. When we first looked at that, there were a range of issues outstanding. I think it would have been quite problematical to work that through an appeal, but I think the last few months have enabled us to deal with some of those technical issues. So the issues that are still in dispute, so to speak, have been narrowed down and would be subject to negotiation through an appeal process. And if they were resolved, that would come back to council for final sign-off in terms of any settlement in an appeal.
And let's talk about the other aspect. If this is approved on Thursday night and then we have no communication then about agreements and infrastructure charges and so forth, about environmental aspects of it, obviously there's no lawyers involved because the applicant's got the approval. So does that communication just cease after that, because then they can just continue on with exactly what we've got in the report?
Yeah. I strongly recommend that council cannot approve it on Thursday night until they know the infrastructure agreement is satisfactory. So we need to do both if we're going to approve it. We need to sign the infrastructure agreement and approve it at the same time if we want to support this development. We can't just do one or the other. So we can't approve it and then continue discussions about the infrastructure agreement, because there's nothing to compel the applicant to do that. They've got their approval. So we need to do both if we're looking to support it.
So if approved, this 4 to 10 million just wipes straight back onto council
to ratepayers.
Pick up the bill.
Yeah, if council was
if
to
not
sign.
Approved, the bits and bobs and lawyer ping pong money we'll be paying will go back to the ratepayers anyway. So either way, we're rocking up Portland. rock and a hard place.
Councillor Wellington.
Yeah, given that you've noted that the applicant was aware that this was coming to this week's round of meetings and provided you with the proposed infrastructure agreement only last Friday, could you please detail how long it is that you have been negotiating with the applicant over this particular subdivision?
Well, the report does outline it in detail, but we have been working with the applicant essentially on a weekly basis since October. There's been numerous meetings between the staff. They've met on site with the applicant. I've met with the applicant. So there's been a number of meetings and negotiations to try and get to the point we are today, which have all been very productive. And as was mentioned, there's a lot of the issues are resolved from a technical perspective. It's come down to the environmental issues and the I guess the mechanics of how we achieve some of the works through the infrastructure agreement. So it's been a quite productive process,
but it's been many months.
It's been many months, and it's been a moving feast. So when new information comes in, it requires a new assessment. We've got a number of technical experts who've been supporting this process with us, so they've had to do assessment. So it's been, a bit of a moving feast.
Ingrid, would you still like to move your deferral
Well,
motion?
I have moved it, yes.
Well, Brad, there's two ways. You can do the procedural, that the motion be deferred, or you can do a defer consideration of the application.
I did the first one.
First.
Yep.
I'll second it.
Second, Councillor Glasgow. Ingrid.
Sure, look, I'm not going to speak long to this deferral motion. As I've said, I'm concerned not having full information in front of me at the moment about this infrastructure agreement that's been put forward, and I would prefer to be in a position of fully understanding that before making a decision on today's recommended motion.
Any other councillor wish to speak?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to be rushed in a decision about this very significant application without having a reasonable analysis carried out of the infrastructure agreement provided by the applicant at the 12th hour. And I emphasise that notion of the 12th hour. They knew that we would be making a decision this week, and they dumped it on us last Friday, as I understand it. Thursday, beg your pardon. The applicant has had months to be able to resolve many of these issues. Councillor Jackson says she's concerned that she doesn't have all the information in front of her. She won't have all the information in front of her on Thursday either, because we won't have our legal advice and a thorough explanation as to the impacts and problems generated potentially by the new infrastructure agreement. If we're not going to have that analysis by Thursday, we're still not going to have all the facts before us.
Yes.
Yeah, down if you do, down if you don't in the situation. It's pretty simple, isn't it? And I can agree with Councillor Wellington in saying that we're really not going to have, and you've pretty much told us that our lawyers are busy anyway, so we're not going to get a full detailed description of the infrastructure agreement anyway, are we? Is that, you can confirm that?
We will try our best, but we can't make commitments on his behalf.
You're not giving me a yes or
So,
a no,
well, I haven't had the conversation, Councillor
so
Glasgow, to say whether I can commit. I'm not even sure whether our lawyer's in court this week.
Yeah.
So
I just have to suggest that I don't want to rush this matter.
Yeah.
And to try and review a legal document in the next few days, I actually don't think it's appropriate. We will try and do it, but I think it's not appropriate.
It's Monday, like we have
major
to be
development.
realistic. It's going to be tough. So, we've talked, and even the man just said before that got up, Councillor Wilkie, about calling it the civic. It is the Shire Business Centre, and Brian pointed it all out in his talk about how it's critical that we get this right. It's our last key site to develop in Noosa, and you guys have been doing a bang up job since October, I know. And you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. We're going to lose out on money playing lawyer ping pong and little bits and bobs here and there that, and lawyers lawyers still aren't cheap. We're not talking a couple $100 invoices here. We're talking, thousands and thousands of dollars to play a lawyer ping pong. But in hindsight, I guess that's a bit better than the 4 to 10 million that's proposed with the loss and infrastructure agreement. I just really hope that you can sit down amicably with the developer in time to come and get this across the line, right? Because, you know, Brian pointed out really, really well in his speech before about just how critical this is, and it's our last key site, and they have got some good things in there. And Ingrid pointed out too how we're going to build a Shire business centre, but they're not clear any trees and make it a big park. Which one do we want? But we still can meet.
So Jess, would you like the matter deferred to Thursday night, or we keep debating it here? We can still.
I've just made my talk about it.
That's right, just spoken to it.
You spoke to the deferral motion?
Are you saying, but
Yeah, just like Tony did.
yeah, are you in favour of that?
He doesn't have to say that
Okay.
till he votes. He doesn't have to state that till he votes.
So I thought you were asking.
Why are you trying to squeeze it out of me, Will?
Sorry. Brian.
I'm going to support the motion, not just because I've already had my say. But because if we're going to relitigate it on Thursday night, we might as well hold over all our arguments to Thursday night. If Councillor Jackson wishes, like a few of the other councillors, like to see just what, you know, even if it is preliminary, what's in the mind of the developer in terms of the last minute development agreement, it might just help resolve what is in dispute and what isn't, even if we don't have the full facts or full analysis of that revised infrastructure agreement. So yeah, I'm happy to defer, because it's likely if we do or we don't, we'll still re-debate it on Thursday night, and brevity is always good.
I'll support the motion. I mean, at the end of the day, the decision is Thursday night, not today's. Asking for some more information, starting the legal process sooner rather than later to envisage this may mean we get an outcome sooner rather than later. So I'm prepared to support this, provided that Councillor Stockwell's communications already on this matter don't have to be debated again on Thursday. No. I'm prepared to support it. I mean, at the end of the day, the decision doesn't get made until Thursday, not really. If we do defer it.
You wish to close?
No, I don't.
Okay. Put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Councillor Wellington?
Can you just call it?
Councillor Jackson, Jerusalem, Glasgow, Stockwell and Wilkie. Against? Councillor Wellington. The motion's carried.
That's the end of that.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Patrick.
You didn't have anything to do for the next few days, did you?
Just a few applications.
So just to clarify, what will happen between now and Thursday night?
So we will obviously liaise with our lawyers to see whether we can get an assessment done of the infrastructure agreement that was provided to us at the end of last week. I again want to manage council's expectations that this is a significant piece of work involved in assessing what the difference is between a new infrastructure agreement compared to a variation on the previous one, as well as what I call the content of the agreement. They're two separate issues, and what are the implications? We need to get it right. So we will have a look at that, but I don't want to raise your expectations that we will have complex and comprehensive legal advice before Thursday night.
Thank you, Ed. Right, thank you. We're going to item 1 on the agenda. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you for all of you.
Which is an MCU development permit for a material change of use, service and utility Type 3 tower situated at 244 Tablelands Road, Cooran. This is from the Planning and Environment agenda, page 3, referred due to the significance of the issue.
I'm happy to move the staff recommendation.
I'll second.
Okay, move. Councillor Jerusalem, Councillor Stockwell seconded it. Joe, you wish to speak to it?
Just that I fully support the stance of staff on this matter. I mean, knowing where this tower is situated with regard to proximity of some of the residents nearby and the amenity, I don't believe that NBN have taken every opportunity here to look at co-locating or other locations that may not be as imposing upon the community as we have been communicated by many members of the community, and I fully support staff position on this matter.
Okay. Yeah,
I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask. One is this: we are presented with something that theoretically NBN could be provided. I assume this is fixed wireless to 247 premises in the area near Cooran. How are these premises currently receiving internet, or are they?
As I understand it, they're currently have access to ADSL, which is of a very low quality.
That's through their telephone line,
Yes,
is it?
that's correct. And at this point in time, there is no plan to upgrade that because the NBN rollout is occurring. So that is my understanding at this point.
So there are the people that are currently in this catchment for NBN have no other option other than ADSL at the moment. Somebody mentioned satellite, so
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
would think the people that don't have ADSL access would have satellite access at this point in time.
That's correct. NBN have indicated that those who don't have a line of sight to a NBN fixed wireless tower have the opportunity to utilise the satellite network. How that actually operates has not actually been made clear by the applicant. We'd have to do much more digging with NBN themselves to try and understand that properly.
So they're saying it already exists, or something that
Yes.
may be.
So
coming
people that are up on Tablelands Road,
Yeah.
Many of those already have access to satellite NBN
with a dish.
with the dish. Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And so those people up there, they already have that access. They'd receive no benefit from the tower because they already have the access to the satellite network. So it's only those down further in the lower areas who would have a line of sight that would even get a benefit from the tower.
Okay. And just to clarify, so a tower such as this for the NBN has to be line of sight in order to. So can I understand, are there many other options for location of such a tower? And I ask that because I understand there's an existing Telstra tower and there's been an issue with the co-location there because of steepness of the land, but also I understand it's sort of lower down, and I'm wondering whether in fact it's viable because of the line of sight.
That's correct. So the existing Telstra tower is located just approximately 100 metres to the southwest of the proposed tower. It's approximately 10 to 15 metres lower than the elevation of the proposed tower. The existing tower has already been extended to a total of 30 metres in height. In saying that, if the co-location were to occur, the applicant maintains that they would only be able to access a maximum height of 20 metres above ground level, which would not give them sufficient line of sight to enough people to be able to make it viable. The applicant maintains that they have also looked at other sites, but they haven't disclosed all of those sites. So we're not sure what was considered or what was discounted about those. So we would need more understanding of that if we were to be supportive of moving forward with this one. However, the line of sight issue is, that is critical to be able to, for patrons to be able to access the service.
So your report does indicate the suggestion that they should seek another site, and that's a possibility, you believe?
I believe it is, yes.
Have we got some knowledge that it is?
There are a couple of people in the area who have suggested that there may be other sites. Some have even suggested that it may be possible on their own property where it doesn't impact on the visibility as much as it does currently. And in one suggestion, it's been suggested that the back section of lot 298 Tablelands Road has been suggested, and it actually sits in very similar to the way the current Telstra tower sits in a concave area of the landform. It sits in a very similar scenario, and be below the trees, so that you wouldn't have the potential for the high visual impact viewed from above. And that's the key thing with this particular one. It sits out on a knoll and it's very visual from all aspects.
Is that something that, who recommended or who suggested this might be an option?
The owner of that property has suggested that that could be an option. He maintains that he has tried to contact the applicant, but has not had any receipt of that acknowledgement yet.
Does this cause a conflict of interest to the submitter of that objection?
I don't believe so. This came about very late in the...
No. Short answer is no. You often get submitters who have, whether they're commercial competitors or people who have skin in the game, so that's quite common.
Okay, thank you.
John.
Just want to clarify a statement you made there.
Yeah.
The tower below the trees. Tower, the line of sight,
yes,
as I understand it, cannot be below the trees. Otherwise, it won't get line of sight. It needs to actually sit above the trees.
Understand what you're saying. So the line of sight for the catchment that this tower is trying to capture, the catchment is primarily to the south and the southeast. The current Telstra tower, for example, it can be seen from the south and southeast. It cannot be seen from the north. So in a similar scenario with the current NBN proposal, if it were able to be seen from the south and southeast, then it could be screened to the north, yes, by the trees.
But there's no way that the tower can sit below the tree line. It must sit above the trees
No.
to gain line of sight, and whether it may be screened from some properties by being
exactly
from it still has to sit above the trees.
Yeah, so where it's screened by trees to the back side of where it's proposed to sit, that would mitigate potential visual amenity.
Just clarifying that the tower actually must sit above trees to get that line of sight. That's what I'm thinking.
Jess.
Yeah, that number, I don't know, 240 houses or whatever it services, is that just low to seem to be chucking a tower up? Is that the sort of standard sort of amount that they'll go for? Is there a benchmark where they won't go below?
I believe there is. I don't exactly know what that number is. The original number proposed was approximately 360 premises, and that was when the tower was originally proposed at 30 metres. 35 metres. So essentially, NBN have made the call and said we can still make it work or make it viable at 247. But actually, what their cutoff is, they haven't disclosed.
It'd be fair to say there are properties there that aren't populated. There'd be vacant blocks of land that could be populated in the future.
Yes.
So there would be future expansion possibilities of it.
Potentially.
Other councillors wish to speak to the motion. Councillor Stockland.
I just support the motion. I think the principle that's getting lost in this is that our plan does try and keep the visual amenity in these areas of our hinterland at a very high level, and that's the key, not just to making the place livable, but it's also a key to growing our tourism product in the hinterland. I wonder whether I should be declaring conflict interest, because I'm also one of these people that lives in an NBN black spot and has to put up with ADSL upload speeds of 0.2 megabytes per second. But I'm not being serviced by this tower. So I think there is a need to look at this from a planning sense, and I think the recommendation is right. I think also from a council perspective, we had some consultation with NBN early in the piece. I think it probably is time to try and get them back in front of councillors and talking about why it's taken so long for the whole of our shire to be connected to a network, to a satellite or to Wi-Fi, because to me it's unacceptable from their behalf.
Yeah, the councillors wish to speak to the motion. Ingrid.
Yeah, I might just say that reading your report, you have written on page 32, the Noosa plan seeks to ensure that communities provided with services and infrastructure needed in the current age of technology, but not at the expense of scenic amenity values and rural character of the region. So obviously we are hoping for a more win-win solution to this issue. I'm concerned about not just this locality, but others in the hinterland where people often tell me about their problems with internet connectivity. It's an issue in today's world. If they're not connected well, this can affect people in all sorts of ways, personally, in business, medically, etc. So I'd really like to see a positive outcome, but I also recognize that we don't want to cause just visual disturbance. I actually went out and had a look on Saturday morning, and the local neighbours in particular see this tower quite visibly, are likely to see it. And it obviously also, from when you're up higher, you see it sticking out a bit. But that probably worried me less. But yeah, I mean, I support the motion that we don't consider this an appropriate site because of the impact on visual amenity.
Councillor Noosa, if you wish to close.
Only to follow off what Councillor Jackson said there. Yes, whilst we are trying to provide, ensure that the services are provided to our community, I mean, a great number of the community here are prepared to forego the location of this tower because of scenic amenity. So they are, and are receiving services in other ways, shapes and forms in the interim. This isn't the first time we've had a tower issue before us, and many of them have challenged the amenity for a few residents in the local area. The proximity of this one and the number of objections to it is readily supported by me.
I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Those against? It's carried unanimously.
Councillors, just note that the reasons of refusal are being reviewed by Council's planning solicitor, so we may have some changes for you at the ordinary meeting.
Thank you. And Nadine, thank you for your concise answers and advice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I told you we were going to be tough because it's a first.
I thought we were.
Okay, next item is item 3 on the agenda, which is the adoption of the consolidated versions of the Noosa Shire Council Local Rule.
What happened to
One.
item 2?
I beg your pardon. How could I have missed that?
Appeals.
Overview of planning appeals. Sorry, Anita.
Sorry.
Probably because of an overview. You just overlooked the overview.
I overlooked the overview. Overview of planning appeals. I haven't marked for it.
What
Planning and Environment Committee agenda.
What original?
Page 57.
Thank you.
Referred due to significance of the issue. Page 57. Councillors, have any questions for staff?
I have some questions.
Ingrid.
Carrie, having read your report tells us that there's 563,537 spent to the end of December on appeals, but Trent Grouf's report in January for the end of December says that in fact 800,000 had been spent so far on appeals in this year. So there's a discrepancy between your numbers and Trent's number. And also Trent's report in January for the end of December said that the budget was 1.1 million, but your agenda item says it's 1 million. So there are two discrepancies, and I'm confused by that.
So the figures these figures in the report come from Trent's report, and the difference in for this financial year, the first 6 months, comes from I've only included the amounts relating to planning appeals resulting from development applications, not compliance matters. So there's other compliance matters that are with our legal team that are, I guess, explain the difference in the amounts.
So his covers all of that.
His covers
the
all
full
of that.
expense.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so even the difference in 1.1 million compared to 1 million budget?
I can't explain that difference because there was $1 million included for this year's budget. We're having to look at increasing it slightly to cover this appeal, so I'm not sure where the difference is coming from.
Could be through a budget review.
Yeah, possibly in the budget review.
I know Trent's report is from the end of the last financial year to the end of January. Your figures
To December.
to December.
No, it wasn't to the end of January. It was the January report that I looked at, not this month's.
Yeah.
I looked at the January report, which is to the end of December.
Right, so
same time frame.
Yeah.
Can I come back to you on that
Yes,
one?
please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it exactly $1 million it was
That was
allowed for, or
that was what was put in the 2019-20 budget. Yeah.
exactly $1 million? So I was just wondering whether Trent wasn't rounding up an element. And okay,
I'm just looking at Trent's report now, since it's the financial.
Not this year.
not this month.
Councillor Jackson was referring to the one was in the
December.
January
meeting,
report.
not the one in the February meeting.
Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry.
The January report is the one that refers to
December.
the end of
Yeah,
December.
they're like
Yeah,
for
I
like
understand. I thought it was
comparisons.
the one on this agenda. Yeah.
And yeah, if you could just clarify that discrepancy is the
Yeah.
difference between those two.
I do have another question, actually, of Brett. Brett, Kerry kindly did all the adding up and said there had been 34 appeals listed, 17 were settled with amendments, 10 were withdrawn, and 7 won through trial. I often hear you say that we win all our appeals, and I'm wondering, do you therefore define withdrawals and settling with amendments as wins?
Short answer is yes, and the reason is that we settle, in appeals withdrawn, often people will put in an appeal to protect their rights. So, you know, we give a refusal, for example, they put an appeal and say, well, we'll have a good look at it, whether or not we would be successful in challenging that in the court. They go away and get their advice and realise they won't be successful, so they withdraw that so the council's decision stands. Certainly at the other end of the scale, the ones where the council has gone through a full trial, has been successful. This council will be one of the few that I'll be aware of has won every contested trial. The ones that are settled are a bit greyer in the middle, so some of those we get a good outcome where we say, well, the developer will pull back or agree to what we were after, and we'd have that outcome that we want from a planning perspective. And in a very small number of cases, we've gone, well, you know, this is an issue that might be contested. Is it a big planning issue or is it not a big planning issue? We want to spend $50,000 or $100,000 to contest 2 square metres of signage or whatever it might be the difference. No, we'll settle. So in that sense, I would have thought that the decisions the council made has preserved the intent or integrity of our planning scheme.
So 17 settlements may have some wins in both sides,
Yeah,
and
sure.
sometimes they're win-win decisions.
Correct.
Or you can't win them all sort
Yeah.
of decisions. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I have another question, I guess, a general one, and that is, as 17 out of the 34, so half ended up with settlements out of court. And, you know, we're constantly puzzling with this thing of, do we move into the appeal, do we refuse something, or do we continue to try and negotiate? And I just wonder if there are so many, 17 seems quite high out of 34 appeals, that ended up with a settlement and a situation where probably both sides gave, you know, give and take, whether that could be done without the expense and very long-term time frame of an appeal process.
Well, that's a good question. In an ideal world, I think that would be right, but I don't think we live in an ideal world, unfortunately. So many cases, it's the structured process through the court mediation session that brings that to a head.
The time frames imposed under the Act.
Yeah.
Where sometimes the time frame's against you, where a decision needs to be made.
One would expect that a level of mediation and all that occurs before.
Of course, always.
So that if settlement can't be achieved, that's only when the final outcome is to go to court.
And
Would that be correct?
Yeah, sometimes, to be blunt, you know, the council's forced into making a decision due to timeframes, otherwise you're in a deemed approval scenario, and therefore you need to work that through. So yeah, it's not an ideal world, but that's the world we live in.
Thank you.
My question was just pretty brief, and it was basically, as a knowledge of local government, Brett, this is common in all local governments. Fighting, not fighting, winning, losing. Do you have any other statistics of someone around our size, kind of what they're spending?
No, not off the top of my head. I know that I think it was Sunshine Coast Council's up over $4 million a year.
Yeah, so Sunshine Coast Council just announced, just put out their figures, and it's 4 times ours. Yeah.
But you'd expect that they're a bigger council.
Yeah, of course.
Secretary appeals.
Yeah, Brisbane is astronomical, I know that, but again, much bigger council.
Yeah, but like, you know, I get a lot of questions like, oh, you're tipping money down the toilet, and so well, we also win a lot, but it's pretty common business in local government to do this. It's not always just cut and dry. So
yeah.
and he said that.
I think the starting point is always to come back to what's the planning principle we're trying to defend, or what's the planning principle we're trying to deal with, and is that worth fighting for? And that's the question, and how much ratepayers funding do we have to need to be able to defend the planning scheme? Because the other alternative is to say, no, we won't defend the planning scheme, therefore we'll have poorer planning outcomes, but maybe save some ratepayers money. We actually want to get the best of both worlds and have the best planning outcome, defend our planning scheme in the court when we have to, but if we're taken to court, and this is what the recommendations alluding to, if we're taken to court to defend the planning scheme from an application that is absolutely contrary to the planning scheme, and we're having to defend ratepayers' monies to do that, we're successful, we're not getting anything back out of that process. That's the issue at the moment.
The Noosa we live in wouldn't be the Noosa we live in had we not defended the planning scheme.
And I think I've said previously with council, it was semi-flippant, but it's true, is that I'd rather spend this money and be successful than spend this money and not be successful in court. We've got a very good track record.
Another question relating to the proposal. There's a couple of recommendations here. One is about seeking the Local Government Association of Queensland to lobby the Department of State Development and Infrastructure Planning for a comprehensive review of the current cost provisions, with a view to including the ability of the court to award costs where development proposal is found to be significantly in conflict with the planning scheme. Are we talking about awarding costs at the end of a court's trial? We're talking here about 34 appeals, 17 settled, X number withdrawn, and only 7 went to finish the trial. So which bits of that are we talking about here?
Yeah, we're only talking about at the end of a trial.
So if it doesn't go that far, there's no costs involved.
That's right. It's only the judge that can award costs. So it would have to go to trial for the costs to be awarded.
Thanks. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'd like to move to...
Can I just clarify a question?
You may.
Was that situation has existed in the past, has it not? That changed at some stage?
Yes, under the previous Planning Act.
Thank you.
Oh.
Right.
Yes, I'd like to move the recommendation.
Moved by Councillor Stockwell. I'll second it. Seconded Councillor Glasgow.
So there's two elements to this motion. The first is about what I believe is a sensible and community-minded approach to planning appeals. And that is that if a developer wants to take a council to court when it is really clear in their planning scheme that their development is in conflict with it, then they should be aware that they're open to paying the costs of council to defend that planning scheme. Now we know not so long ago the Court of Appeal, was it, had reviewed decisions of judges in the Planning Environment Court and said, basically, you've got no right to override a planning scheme. You've got the right to judge whether the planning scheme has been implemented and is being interpreted correctly. And that's hopefully put a bit of a shockwave through some of the judges in the Planning Environment Court. But I do think that this concept that the ratepayers should have to pay up to the most expensive case we've had in front of us, the Tomco appeal, which is over $1 million. And this is where this concept came out of the community, saying, really, in that judgment, our co-respondent felt that it was quite clear that the development was inconsistent with what the planning scheme said, and it is inconsistent that the community should have to pay for a developer trying to break the planning scheme, and I agree. You might want to compare that to, say, the QIC appeal, which was much more finely balanced, quite large. It was over $800,000 out at the Noosa Shire Business Centre. And that one, as I said, the argument was finely balanced, but the way we won it, which is really important, is the judge said the Noosa Shire Council has a history of defending and upholding its planning scheme. Who am I to differ? And that's really important in every decision we make. So I think we've got good news that we're winning most. The bad news is sometimes we probably should, if the state government was acting in the public interest, they would review the Planning Act. They would make the cost provisions reflect the ability, will give the judges the ability to look at the nature of the appeal when considering costs. But then there's the second element. The second element, and as a planner, it's one that I find incongruous once again in the current system of planning and building appeals, and that is the actions of the tribunal. So the tribunal is different than an appeal in that it sets referees, and what we're arguing is that the referees should be more consistently appointed that are more consistent with the purpose and have a better understanding of the subject matter of my words. Okay, so we have in the last few days received an email from staff which identify some of our experiences with the tribunal. And this varies depending on which referees are appointed to make that decision. But some of the things we've had to put up, they appear to have made up their mind before hearing from both parties. They've inappropriately quoted what other council planning schemes allow and to attempt to apply it to the case before them. They are not well versed in planning law, stating that they must consider the applicant's personal financial circumstances, make statements and draw conclusions that go beyond their professional expertise. Now, as a planner, I've worked in sections that have had building surveyors and they do their job well, which is about assessing structural adequacy. They have no training or expertise in interpreting or applying the principles of planning as outlined in a planning scheme, and to compare the results in the tribunal where out of 26, we've actually lost 11. And out of 4 going to the tribunal, we've lost about 1 out of 2. And that's probably because of the inconsistency in the referee's understanding of professionalism being applied. So I think it's really important that we do point out to the state government that we're unimpressed with the way they're appointing their referees. We think the planners should be making decisions on the tribunal about planning matters, and those planners should be at the top of their game and not having people qualified to assess structural adequacy considering matters that require planning professionalism.
Just a clarifying question. Preferably you would prefer to have people versed in planning law on the tribunals. What sort of qualifications do they tend to have, if any?
In our experience, they have a range of qualifications. So we've had building certifiers, building designers, architects and planners. The experience level amongst them they don't have a significant amount of experience from what I can tell. So it's varied a little bit depending which tribunal they've attended.
The councillors wish to speak to the motion? Wish to close one?
No, I can't debate any arguments.
Those in favour?
That first one you spoke, yeah.
Against, motion's carried unanimously. Anita.
Councillor, can I suggest we deal with the other item, other planning application, and now Kerry will be able to head off. She's got a few things to do.
Sure.
N+1.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
it's
item
item
5,
five.
which
good
is
idea.
Lorikeet Drive. It just allows the land development applications to be done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's page 3 of the General Committee report.
Yeah, not that one. This one. Why do I do that? Get out.
Aren't we supposed to somehow agree as a council or group to vote to change the agenda, or is that just something the chair can do?
Oh, sorry. Is there any objections to us changing the agenda so that the planning staff can remain at the table?
There's no objection.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That the order of business can be changed at the discretion of the chair, but there can be dissension ruling for that.
Yeah, right.
So I have a question. In this area, we've had experience with development applications that tend to use the adjacent parkland to store building equipment that might go over and interfere with vegetation in the park. Is there anything in these sort of approvals that we can actually add a condition that says yes, providing that, or is that just a standard condition anyway that people breach?
Standard
In this particular instance, the planning scheme does seek to ensure that public access is not gained directly from the premises to the coastal area. The anticipation of that would be to maintain existing defined coastal access paths. Otherwise you get incremental degradation throughout the dual area. So we have been able to condition that no gates be included in a rear fence scenario. So if that's what you're referring to, then Yes.
Oh, it's more. I was thinking mainly during the construction process where the damage is nearly done, like the builders might go and use it as their storage area.
Yep.
They might say, oh, the boss told me to go and chop down these branches and trees, and you know, that's the sort of thing that happens during the construction process. I thought if we made it really clear that the fine won't be big, much more than $1 million would do that.
Yeah, how about we include an advisory note in the decision notice that states that they're not allowed to use the council reserve for construction to construct from and storage. So I can draft that.
Vehicles.
Vehicles for the ordinary meeting.
Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you.
So the local bush
So
community
I do wonder where they'll put their materials, given that.
does spend a lot of time in that area caring for it. There'll be a lot of interest in that.
Okay.
Yeah, all picked up. Okay.
Well, I was interested in the comment about no gate, because I understand at the moment there's no fence. And I'm not sure why anyone would put a fence in, or if it's a nice bushland area. So that gate thing doesn't necessarily stop people from finding pathways. No.
It's reflective of a scheme requirement, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there's no fence in the landscaping plan or anything like that I could envisage. I did question the mention of a gate there as well as to where the gate was likely to go if there's no fence at all.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, it's purely reflective of the planning scheme requirements.
Councillors, anyone care to move that?
I'll move it.
Move Councillor Wellington, second Councillor Glasgow. Just ahead of you. Councillor Wellington wish to speak to it?
No, I don't need.
Councillors wish to speak to the motion?
Just shows
in favour. That's unanimous. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Kerry.
Okay.
Go to item 3, Anita. You're really up this time.
Yes, thank you.
I promise.
Really and truly. You're going at 12?
Be there at 12.
Okay. Note Councillor Glasgow is leaving the meeting, please. Condolences, Jess. That's item 3, adoption of consolidated versions of Noosa Shire Council Local Law Number 1, 2015 Subordinate Local Law Number 1, Administration, 2015 and Subordinate Local Law Number 4, Local Government Controlled Areas, Facilities and Roads. This is Planning and Environment Committee agenda, item 4, page 66. Councillor Wellington.
Dorothy Dixon for the CEO. Council's already adopted or Anita it could be, has already adopted the local law amendments relating to advertising devices. Can I, for the sake of those who don't understand why it's suddenly before us, can you please explain why this matters before us today?
Yes, in the last report to council there was a recommendation that I bring back the consolidated version. So under the Local Government Act, not only does council adopt the amendments, they separately adopt the consolidated versions of those amendments into the local laws.
So this is a procedural
matter? It's a procedural matter.
Yeah.
Thank you. Happy to move it.
Move Councillor Wellington. Seconded. Seconded Councillor Stockwell. Councillor Wellington. Oh yeah. You already have
No.
Councillor Wellington.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I'll just say that it's purely a procedural matter. We've already had the debate. We've had a result. This is a matter of just accommodating that previous result so that it's ticks all the I's and crosses all the T's.
Thank you.
Well, I do have a question actually, and that is, here we are asked to adopt. I haven't got at my fingertips the wording of the recommendation from our previous meeting. So what is it that we actually did at our previous meeting?
So council resolved to make the amendments.
Amendments,
and now they adopt the consolidated
now we
versions.
Adopt.
That's
okay.
right.
All right. So it wasn't really adopted before; it was made.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's maybe semantics in the wording, but that's the legal wording. And it has been gazetted as well.
It has already been gazetted.
That's correct.
Right. Oh, and does that mean does that gazettal mean it's already a formal local law?
At the commencement date of the 28th of February. So council's required to make the amendments, which then within a month's time of making that decision has to appear in the Government Gazette and on council's website, and that was undertaken. and this is just procedural in terms of those amendments have now been incorporated into our local law.
We've actually got to see the local laws written as local laws and amended local laws and where they sit within the grand scheme of all of the local laws, which we didn't see last time.
No, they were amendments. They were insert, delete, etc.
So it creates a consolidated version.
Yeah.
I also have another question, and that's about the recommendation section B. There's information here requesting us to sign off on fees for applications for $150 per sign for pylon sign, pole sign, or freestanding sign, and $100 per illuminated sign. Is this in addition to what was in the local law that was made by council previously? Have we seen these figures in a previous council meeting?
Yes.
So previously we did discuss costs for signage. However, that was based on, I guess, the early version, the first version of the local law, which had a greater number of signs proposed as requiring approval. Mm-hmm. So we envisaged a greater number of applications coming forward, and what was proposed at that time was up to 3 signs would be $150. On further consideration of the time that it would take to receipt, assess compliance on an application, it's now proposed at $150 per sign. We won't be getting too many of these applications anyway. The $100 per illuminated sign has remained unchanged. That was always proposed as that.
Okay.
Did we not have a fee for illuminated signs prior to this anyway?
Currently or previously discussed?
Prior to these changes being made, did we not have a...
Yes, we always had the $100 per illuminated sign. Yeah, that's not new.
It's always been consistent.
Just to adopt it.
Okay. Adopt it for the new local law.
Okay.
Because it's moved from the planning scheme to the local law.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Councillor, speak to the motion.
You finished it?
Oh, has it been moved?
Yeah. It's been moved and
Oh,
seconded.
sorry, you moved it. I will speak. On consideration, I will say that we are now being asked to adopt, and we weren't asked to adopt before. So I'd like to say that I am in favour of new Noosa design principles and putting limits on signage. We certainly don't want Noosa to end up looking like Nicklin Way, but I do not do backflips. I voted against endorsing the signage laws in December, and I'm going to do that again here in terms of adoption, as they are exactly the same now as they were then. The reasons that I was not supportive of the local laws is that we haven't simply transferred signage rules out of the planning scheme into local laws. We made, the council is making quite a number of changes, and I think some of them are particularly negative for smaller businesses. The things I do not support in the local law is things like not allowing any real estate directional signage except one right in front of the property for sale. Council allows 6 at the moment, and I moved an amendment to make it only 4, but that was knocked back. This new local law I consider goes too far, and in the end it particularly impacts on the smaller businesses. The big guys aren't affected because they have the prime real estate in central locations. I also do not support not allowing subtenants of a tenancy to have A-frames while everyone else is allowed to have an A-frame.
So point of order.
Point of order.
What's that, Councillor?
The council appears to be debating the motion that was passed, not debating the procedural motion of incorporating those amendments into the local law. The only relevant argument is about whether the process that we are going through is accurate, and in my opinion, I don't believe a procedural motion to consolidate it opens the debate up for policy debate anymore.
Look, I have to agree with Councillor Stockwell in this case, Councillor Jackson.
Can I discuss this? What is the process here? Because I think we have made, but we haven't adopted before.
You can dissent from my ruling if you wish.
That's the appropriate process.
Okay.
So there's been, just to explain the process, so there's been a Point of order, no. The chair's made a ruling. If you don't agree with it, you can do a notice of dissension from that ruling on the point of order. That's the most appropriate way to deal with it.
There's been a dissent.
And then the chair has made a ruling
So
on
you
that.
can dissent against my ruling.
Okay, I
Let you
shall
debate
I shall object to your ruling in
Yeah,
that case.
okay.
Dissent from the chair's ruling.
Yeah, move
Dissent
motion,
from the
of,
chair's
motion of dissent from the ruling of the
Okay.
chairperson.
Yeah.
That's moved by Councillor Jackson.
And I support that.
Well, hang on, you don't get to talk to it.
Can I,
You don't get to
can I
talk.
second her motion?
You don't get to talk to it.
Somebody has
Can I
to
second her
second.
motion?
Yes, you're about to go on.
I know, I just said I'm just supporting her seconding
You
the
can
motion.
second that, Joe.
That's all I said.
Fair enough.
Who seconded it, sorry?
Joe.
Correct me if I'm wrong, only the chair and the dissenter
Correct.
can speak.
Yeah, so the only two that can talk to this are the person who moved the motion of dissent and the chairperson.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so.
So I think it's very clear, while of course it's always difficult for people who are not lawyers to understand words, that this is the time we're being asked to adopt a local law. The content of that local law is just as much relevance as the fact that it's previously been made. We are still having to adopt it as a council, and therefore if I object to the content of that local law, I have a right to speak on that behalf of the community, particularly the ones that I consider are being disadvantaged through this local law. I don't see that adopting bans the ability to speak about the policy matter that is within the local law.
I've got a question, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
If you don't mind. The report to council actually says draft local law amendments for advertising devices were adopted by council at its meeting on the 19th of December 2019. So I would just like some clarification, please. Did we adopt them or did we not?
The specific wording was that council note the report, etc., and resolve to make the following changes. To proceed with the making of and make administration local law number 1 2019 as altered. So that's the wording for each of them.
Okay, Anita, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pass this to the CEO. The report tells us that we have adopted those that resolution. Therefore, do we take the report as read or not, given that not only were they adopted, but they have now been gazetted at the state level? How can the state gazette something that we haven't adopted?
So the state doesn't gazette things, the council gazettes it, so we actually put it into the gazette ourselves. So,
but it's into the state
documents. No, the gazette is basically the state newspaper, for want of a better phrase, that deals with legal notices. So what happens is the council has put that into the gazette.
Yeah, fair enough.
So it's not actually made by the state through the gazette, it's the council who does that. So what the council has done is to proceed with the making of various local laws and make the changes that we had identified at that time. And the relevant part then is in paragraph F of the previous council decision. The decision is to bring forward the consolidated version of local law 1, subordinate local law number 1, subordinate local law number 4, for adoption and commencement in early 2020 to enable the local law amendments to commence when the new planning scheme takes effect.
So the previous resolution refers to the term adoption?
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
No.
It talks to make. The provision in paragraph F refers to bring forward the consolidated version of the 3 local laws I've mentioned for adoption and commencement.
Would it be fair to say we can't
Yes,
adopt
it does
them
refer to it.
Would it be fair to say we can't adopt them until we actually see the final written version of the local law?
So what you have today before you for adoption, just to be very clear, is those consolidated versions of what the council resolved to make last year.
And how they would appear as a local law.
Correct.
Including
as a
the
consolidated
content.
version, including the content.
Yeah.
So now the chair has the right to speak to the dissension motion.
Yes.
So can I get a simple answer? The report says that the amendments for advertising devices were adopted by council at this meeting on the 19th of December. You are now suggesting, Mr. CEO, that that is not correct.
What I'm referring to is not what's in the report, but what's in the council decision. If you have a look on page...
Yeah, but I'm asking you whether or not the sentence in the report is accurate.
So can you refer me to that sentence, please?
It's the very first sentence in the report, Mr. CEO.
In the report before us today.
Correct.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it says it was adopted, yet the recommendation is to adopt.
Yeah, I think we're getting a bit caught up in semantics. What happened, again, the best way to answer that question is to go to the heart of what the council decision was. And the council decision set out on page 67 is that the council proceed to make the various changes, and the council decision is to bring back for adoption and commencement the consolidated version. That's what's happening now.
So the use of the word adopt in the first line of the executive summary is probably incorrect. Incorrect semantics, because the actual recommendations are to adopt.
Yeah, look, I think the ordinary reading of any non-lawyer would be that that's what took place at that meeting out at Federal Hall that night. Was the council debated and ended up with an agreed position in terms of what the advertising devices amendments should be. But what we're doing today is, as I said, set out in paragraph F, which is we are adopting those.
Okay, look, I'll speak to the motion before us. What we agreed to do at the last council meeting was to proceed with the making of these laws. We had extensive debate about that at that time. This is essentially a procedural motion to adopt what we agreed to make at the last meeting. So we had extensive debate at the last meeting, at that meeting last year about that. All parties had adequate chance to have their say on each individual aspect of these local laws, and this is not, in my opinion, the forum to re-prosecute each and every one of those at this time. We did resolve to proceed to the making of these laws as debated, and we've had that debate. So that's why I ruled the way I did, and that we need to direct our comments towards this procedure that's before us, which is we adopt what we resolved to create at the last meeting, which was on 19th of December last year. So I'll put the motion. Oh, sorry.
The dissension motion.
And put the dissension motion. Sorry. Councillor Jackson was
no.
Okay.
Just both speak. There's no closure. I think it's just each person speaks.
Okay. Those that are in favour of the motion that the chairperson's ruling be dissented from. Those are Councillor Jackson and Councillor Jurisidic. Those against, Councillor Wellington, Stockwell and Wilkie. The motion's lost. So Councillor Jackson, go back to talking to the motion that is before us today.
Oh, well.
You have the floor.
I don't. Well, I'm not allowed to talk now.
As long as we're not re-prosecuting what we did in December.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I have anything more to say other than the fact that because I didn't support the making of this local law, I'm not going to support the adoption of this local law, and I've already made a few comments about why that is. So,
Councillor Jurisidic,
I likewise won't be supporting the adoption of the local law for reasons that I iterated during the meeting when we debated this, because I can't mention them again now, which I think is an incorrect ruling, but. I can't explain why I won't. I can't further explain why I won't support the adoption of the local law as a result of your rulings. So I'll just leave it at that statement for the reasons that I iterated at the time when I disagreed with.
Okay. Anybody else wish to speak to the motion? Councillor.
So what we're being asked to do.
Councillor Wellington, you open. You're open. Okay.
I did too. Sorry, beg your pardon.
Councillor Wellington, you wish to close?
Yeah, I'll just say this is about accepting the democratic decision of the council so we can complete a process that's already begun And a failure to accept a democratic decision by council is a failure, I believe, in the roles of any councillor. All of us have at times situations where we either...
Point of order.
Councillor.
I believe this is moving towards fairly reputation damaging kinds of statements, which are an opinion, and I think it's inappropriate.
Reputation damaging
Yes,
statements.
he's maligning people who choose to vote a different way than himself.
Okay. Right, Councillor Wellington, perhaps just keep your comments related to the motion before us.
Yep. The motion before us is about accepting the democratic decision of council. That decision was made on the 19th of December. And it therefore behoves me, regardless of what I thought on the 19th of December, to support a democratic decision of this council by voting in favour of this motion, which is simply to complete the process of that democratic decision on the 19th of December.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour? That's Councillor Wellington, Stockwell and Wilkie. And those against? Councillors Jackson and Juricevic. We now, thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
We're now going to item 4, which is the Noosa Community Health and Wellbeing Plan. Reason for referral, further consideration. This is on the Services and Organisation Committee agenda, page 3.
Mr. Chair, can I suggest a very short toilet break? Council's been going for a while. We're just waiting for our staff to come up anyway. So
Oh, okay.
Is that
Yeah.
that would make sense?
Wellbeing plan, yep.
Yeah. recording that complex.
Bowlers get bad backs.
Yeah, not when you bowl as slow as I do.
Right, councillors, we're back. Welcome back, everybody. I declare the meeting open again. We're up to item 4, was the Noosa Community Health and Wellbeing Plan. Welcome Sunil, Kerry and Wayne. Councillors, the item's here for further consideration. Any questions for staff?
I might have a question actually, Sunil. You may not be aware because you weren't here, but when this report was first being developed, I was the councillor on the residents group, and we adopted it, we approved it for the purpose of public consultation in December last year. I'm interested to hear whether there are anything significantly different about what is being presented now.
There was no feedback from the public consultation.
Sorry, that was December 2018, before your arrival.
Yeah. No feedback from there.
No.
So the same draft was tabled at the SNO meeting with just one amendment, and that was around climate change, including the impact of climate change on human health and possibilities of the health and well-being plan being impacted by that. So we did the with Councillor Brian Stockwell, the proposed amendment that will be tabled today.
Okay.
So I think, given that this plan is quite different to a lot of our other plans that have more of a community level of involvement, this one was developed very closely with stakeholder groups that have their own plans in place. So we weren't surprised that out the other side there was little change. So that it gave us a level of comfort that everyone's heading in the right direction.
And at the end of the day, this is really about cooperation, collaboration between all the entities that have responsibility, because each have specific roles to play within.
Yes.
And what our role is in a lot of this is advocacy, to be honest.
Yes.
Yeah. That's that. I think I alluded to that at the SNO meeting.
Yes.
So another question of mine actually links with this, and it's not that we're just advocacy. One of the great things about the report is that it differentiates the roles that council has. In some cases, it has a carriage of something and a responsibility. In some cases, it's advocacy. In some cases, it's collaboration, and it's very clear. I'm wondering whether given that actually there are a lot of actions and there are a lot of responsibilities allocated through this report, whether there is thought given to resourcing and funding of actually implementation.
So
yes, and for the various actions in the draft action plan, we'll go through the normal annual budgeting process for new initiatives, table it as a new initiative, and then apply for resources to council through that process.
Right.
And there has indeed been, as part of the development of the 2021 draft budget, an inclusion of something for council to consider as part of implementing the action from that.
Okay, good to hear.
Yep.
Are there any significant actions that we need to address?
In terms of the initiative within the budget or the action within the plan?
The action within the plan.
I guess from my perspective, what we've looked at is making sure that the works that we had started on, we're able to fully address within the completeness of what we should be doing. So, for example, the things like the swimming pool program and the inspection program, which sit underneath as part of that plan, doing those types of works, to then be able to fully engage with, for example, our health stakeholders, Department of Health, etc.
At the portfolio meeting last week, in the plan itself, there are some statistics regarding unhealthy weight in Noosa, which puts it at a higher rate than the Queensland average. But there were recent reports that Noosa has the lowest obesity rates in regional Australia. We were able to compare the data in this report with any latest data that was sort of underpin those media reports.
No, not on obesity, but we did on the vaccination rates and followed that through. just in terms of comparative analysis between Queensland, Australia and Noosa.
Yes.
And those were changed and amended.
Yeah, no, that was very well. I just wondered if...
But not for obesity.
Yeah. Just curious that Noosa got headlines for having the lowest rates in regional Australia, and yet we're down here as having unhealthy weight above the Queensland average. It's just an interesting disparity.
And so staff will be looking into where the data source was from the information that was in the media to see whether it's the same source of data or something new.
Could that be the different reference centres? In that regional Australia is typically higher levels of obesity than
and so it's about trying to understand exactly where the data came from, what the sample size was, etc.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so Councillor Stockley, you have an amendment?
Yeah, so councillors, I do propose a motion that includes additional wording and there is a lot. I did circulate it last, I got stuff circulated, and these words have been suggested by Sir Neil, thank you very much. And it was to add to page 12. I'll read it out.
You read it out.
Yep. And the insert is to include a new section 7.5 to read: the World Health Organization maintains that climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. Australia's climate has already begun to change, and current trends indicate that this will accelerate over the course of this century. A changing climate is expected to affect human health and well-being, including physical and mental health, through direct and indirect pathways. Climate change can be framed as a risk amplifier, that is, many of the risks associated with climate change are not new, however they are likely to increase in severity over time. There is no evidence available to indicate that the risks from climate change to health and well-being are not presently significant at a local scale, however they will increasingly become so as the global warming accelerates. The Australian Medical Association has expressed strong concerns regarding the threat to public health and well-being from climate change. In particular, the elderly, as well as other vulnerable groups in the community, are more exposed to direct physical impacts of climate change and may require greater assistance from their familial and social networks and emergency services in preparing for and responding to extreme weather events. The collaboration of many stakeholders will help Noosa's health and wellbeing sector to be resilient to future climate changes. Noosa Council is developing a climate change adaptation plan which will contain actions and key indicators for adapting Noosa's health and wellbeing to climate change risks. The climate change adaptation plan is expected to be completed in mid-2020. It is proposed that the Community Health and Wellbeing Action Plan will seek to inform the climate change adaptation plan where applicable and incorporate the relevant actions from that plan at the next level review of the action plan, including development of new initiatives based on updates to climate change projections if required.
I'll second it.
So, councillors,
can I make a request that the mover makes a couple of minor tweaks to the wording for the sake of clarity? In the last paragraph, the first sentence, be resilient to future climate change impacts rather than climate changes. Climate changes is simply the temperature change, but it's the impacts from climate that are of concern.
Get rid of the S.
And the next sentence, adapting Noosa's health and wellbeing. Noosa is a shire. Can I suggest the Noosa community's health and wellbeing to climate change risks? Thank you.
I'm happy with that.
You're happy with that?
Okay. So, councillors, the health and wellbeing plan, as drafted and presented to the Service and Organisation Committee agenda, is a logical set of actions. It's a well-drafted document, but in my view, when I looked at it, it was silent on one of the most significant threats to the health and wellbeing of our community. And like much of the East Coast, the unprecedented fires we experienced starting well before the normal fire season in spring are a clear reminder that the climate emergency is not something we need to worry about in the future. It is here and it is now. Over the last 5 months, our community has experienced firsthand the primary impacts of climate change. For weeks on end this summer, people around the nation were being told it is dangerous to undertake outdoor exercise due to poor air quality. Fire chiefs and scientists from around Australia all agree that the severity and longevity of the fire season was exacerbated by climate change. Now, I've got a diagram there that I won't go that into detail, but that is the threats to health and well-being of climate change. We know that at-risk people in our community are being affected by extreme heat, that there are mental health impacts caused by the severe weather that created catastrophic fire conditions, that in turn led to long periods of air pollution. So my motion aims to put in place the acknowledgement of that risk and foreshadows future amendments to this plan to take into account the priorities that emerge from our climate change adaptation plan. The literature foreshadows that secondary effects may occur after a period of time has elapsed after an event, for example. And I thought the cover of the next one of the climate change reports, next one, was perhaps a good indication.
Only got on one screen.
Oh, you got it there. That doesn't matter. Okay. It says that humidity increases the survival time and feeding rate of disease-carrying mosquitoes and hence increases transmission potential of diseases such as Ross River fever. And it's interesting that we are having this current debate about the big influx of mosquitoes just at this point in time. But as we go on, sea level rise may increase the number of times, well, it will, at times a salt marsh is inundated, and that makes breeding conditions more prevalent. A warmer spring may increase the density of the allergenic pollens that can trigger asthma. And the tertiary impacts go on to more stretched out time and more difficult to attribute to a particular event or exposure. But they are the things like increased physical and mental trauma. But what's really concerning, I suppose, is we sit around this table and we are all of a certain age. But the Australian Psychological Society has stated that 95% of Australian youth believe climate change is a serious problem and they're extremely worried. After reviewing the research on climate anxiety among young people, the Society called for governments to declare a climate emergency, which we've already done. Another survey of 1,595 high school and university students between 14 and 23 found that 82% of respondents agreed with the statement, climate change is going to diminish my quality of life in the future. And 1 in 5 students said they were planning to either not have children or have fewer children because of climate change. Our colleagues in the Cairns City Council last year undertook a survey of high school students from across the city and gave them the opportunity to express their concerns, hopes and aspirations in a youth summit. That summit aimed to help the Shire shape its actions, the city shape its actions on climate change. Councillors, I believe we should be doing the same thing. We should be bringing our young people in and helping them address that anxiety by becoming part of the solution. We're fortunate we have a $1 million grant to help build the resilience of the community, and that may be one way it could be spent in part. So I think it is clear that we need to be acknowledging the concerns about health and wellbeing. It's not just going to be youth. We already heard that our seniors are also an at-risk population, and I think it's important that we engage all our community, and particularly youth, in developing actions to address the risks.
Anybody else wish to speak to the motion?
Yes, I do. I'd like to say that I agree with the changes added in the sense that climate change is an impact on well-being. I actually would extend that to say that climate change is a relevant issue throughout all the strategies and plans that Council is working on. And I would even go further and say well-being is relevant in all the strategies and plans that Council is doing. So I was disappointed when the word well-being was removed from the Noosa River Plan draft. I think these are things that need to be considered. So I think this is a useful addition. I'd also like to talk a little bit about my experience as a councillor on the reference group for the well-being plan, health and well-being plan. And I'd like to say I really found it an exceptional experience. The people invited to be on the reference group were all people with health and medical background or people in the academic world working with issues to do with health and well-being, and also Aboriginal groups that were concerned with Aboriginal or traditional people's health. It was an exceptionally high level of participation. It basically was a workshopping group. It wasn't just sort of a reference group. And the quality of the outcome was very much impacted by the quality of the people that were at that reference group. And I'd also like to give tribute to the work which was done in 2018, so we're late now, but it was done by Jeff Atherton and also Fox Rogers, who was there at every reference group meeting, but I know he had a lot to do with the preparation of this report. So I think this is an exceptionally well thought through report. It's very systematic. It's considered everything from the major frameworks internationally to Australia to the States and down to local level. And I'm very pleased that Sunil has now come to join us, and I'm now going to carry forward with what I think is a very important document. Thank you.
I'd like to move an amendment. Kyle, if you can bring that up. It's basically the addition of extra information that Sunil was able to source for us. The Wellbeing plan and the draft that was before us contains the immunisation rates for Noosa alone, but Sunil was also able to source the comparative data, the immunisation rates for Queensland and Australia, which helps show a clear pathway towards the work that needs to be done. You
might want to test whether there's a seconder before speaking to the item.
Yeah.
I'll second.
Seconded, Joe. Joe, did you move the original motion?
He seconded the original motion.
I'll second it.
You can't second it. Seconded by Councillor Jackson. So, it's as written there, councillors.
You might want to read it out.
Okay, so the health status, immunisation rates, percentage target to prevent outbreaks of vaccine preventable disease is 95%. For 1-year-olds in Noosa, it's a rate of 88%, 2-year-olds 86%, 5-year-olds 91%. That's the information that's currently contained in the plan, and Sunil has been able to source additional information for the rates in Queensland for a 1-year-old 94%, 2-year-old 92%, 5-year-old 95%, and also Australia-wide, 1-year-old 94%, 2-year-old 91%, and 5-year-old 95%.
Can I clarify something with Sunil on the figures that are presented before us?
Sure.
So those figures that were there previously were 2017
Correct.
figures, and the current figures show actually a decline in the immunisation rates over the last 3 years in the Noosa region. Is that, as I read, apart from 5
Yeah,
years?
from 1-year-old and 2-year-olds a decline with the 2018-2019 data, which was annualised.
It's interesting that 1 and 2s are down and 5s are up. But anyway,
Go to school.
Just to clarify, that's an interesting point you raised. There is a requirement for school-aged children to be immunised before attending school, is that?
Yes.
That could attribute to the 5-year-olds then.
Yes.
Okay.
So, councillors, I'll speak to the amendment. It's just providing more complete information regarding immunisation rates. Be of interest to anyone who reads the plan, but also gives the relevant agencies targets to work towards. Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? Put the amendment. Those in favour? Against? Carried unanimously. Go back to the original motion. Stockwell and Jackson have spoken to it. Anyone else wish to speak to the motion?
I commend the report. So I think it's well written. I commend the amendments as such. I just wonder if there's any benefit in looking at data over time within the report to see falling immunisation rates or things like that, so that we can actually track data over a period of time rather than just a snapshot. As a comment for staff to consider.
Certainly one of the actions within the report is around data and being able to better track and collate data, particularly with our stakeholders. So one of the challenges in this space is who is collecting what data and what does that actually look like. There's collecting slightly different data means it's then very difficult to make good use of it. So that's
but I would think that having some indication of the tracking of data within the report may be beneficial for the future.
Yep.
Okay. Wish to close?
I do, and I suppose I agree with Councillor Jackson's statements. Firstly, that climate change is something we should look at across all our policies and plans, and secondly, I think we should thank both the existing lot of staff and, as Councillor Jackson did, those who have previously been involved to getting to this point. I think I agree that wellbeing is a really significant aspect of our community. We're fortunate that in surveys done that the wellbeing of our community is well above state and national averages, and there's a range of reasons for that, but I think we need to plan to keep it that way. So I recommend the motion to all councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Sock. I put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Carried unanimously. Thank you, Sunil.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne.
Thanks, Wayne.
The last report is the financial performance report for January 2020. Trent, welcome.
Would you like me to answer Councillor Councillor Jurassic's question now, or shall I wait?
Oh, may as well.
Wayne, could you just hang around for one question? This is a good question relating to waste.
Okay. Councillors, questions for Trent or Wayne?
Well, hang on, I think I had one for Wayne. Sorry, I might have got that wrong, Wayne. I thought I had one for you.
You contributed well, Wayne.
No, sorry, it was a part below. Sorry, my apologies. It was the section below.
One about planning one.
Sorry, it was the section below. I thought it was a waste question. It wasn't a waste question. Okay. I only wanted to see. I only want to see if you'd actually come back.
So Wayne, no.
So, Joe, to answer your question, the training budget has a variance currently of $39,000. You'll be pleased to know that there's $43,000 on order, covering 3 areas of leadership development. I think I've mentioned to you before, we're doing some good work with our under-30s. I don't know if other councillors are aware of that. We've actually got a network of our under-30s, and we're putting them through professional development, about 20 of those, and that covers both the indoor staff and the external staff. So we bring them together once a month to look at their, teach them personality profiling and how to deal with others, communication skills and so on. So we've invested pretty heavily in them, and similarly with what I call our top 30 leaders across the organisation as well. So
got a question relating to that. Yep. That goes on from that as well. Seeing as you brought up this, I said, yet we've been keeping on track until now. So it was disappointing to see a slight fall, but I dare say with the emergencies and all the rest of it, we've had an issue there. How much of that staff training budget also relates to, or is that the pool that it comes out of, with regard to staff attending national conferences and interacting with employees and staff in similar organisations, with relation to the type of matters that we deal with?
None of this budget you're referring to in that part of that report deals with that. Each of the departments has a conference budget, for want of a better phrase, where they send staff away to that.
How much of that do we utilise?
Well, I couldn't answer that off the top of my head.
Can you take that question on notice?
Sure.
I'd love to know what sort of attendance we have at conferences and the like, because I've often mentioned opportunities with certain things that I come across, and I don't know whether they get attended to or not.
Offhand, Councillor, you'll find that we spend most, if not all, of that on any given year. It's quite a.
I've never seen what we do. I never seen what we do spend, Trent. So it'd be interesting to know what the spend is and what the level of attendance of national or state conferences with regard to planning matters, for example.
Sure. That's easy.
Yep. We've got a whole heap of questions.
Keep going.
Anybody else?
You're on a roll.
All right, I'll start at the beginning. Rates and levies. General rates 145 a k above year-to-date budget. Waste utility charges 333 k above year-to-date budget. That's 478 k of 1.13 million where we're ahead of budget. Where's the rest coming from? You mentioned two elements which are less than 50% of the. If you go up top, we're somewhere in the report. We're 1.1 million above tracking ahead in rates and levies, weren't we?
So if you look at the summary on that same table, Joe, on the left, in the middle thing, it's 70 million is 102% of the annual budget of 68.6
Yeah, so we're that's what I got on, 1.3 million above our annual budget. With regard to rates and levies. So you've mentioned two elements there, which constitutes less than half of that 1.3 million. Where's the rest? What are the other benefits we're getting from rates and levies? Seeing as there's that general rates and waste utility charge there, which are the two most significant ones as far as I can see.
What you'll find, one of the peculiarities with our profiling of our budget for rates is that the money comes in and the revenue comes in July and January, and then for the most part in August and February we get a lot of the discounts and rebates recognised. So what you have is you'll have in January will be above budget because we're talking at the total year's worth of revenue, and then the following month we don't actually recognise or we don't show the discounts that come through into the following month when they actually pay, because the ratepayer doesn't get their discount until such time as they pay.
Okay,
so when you look at that $70 million spent, $70 million earned, and a 68.7 full year budget, we've got a basically there's a revenue cut in our budget coming in
to
February,
be accounted for,
which is the discount.
Just an accounting. There's an element of accounting.
It's just an accounting timing.
It's a significant amount of
accounting. That's right. But most of it is in terms of all the other levies and charges outside of the general rates and waste utilities. The variances aren't major. Some are marginally over, some are marginally under. It's mainly in the general rates and the waste utility charges. Okay. We've got the positive variance issue so far.
Fair enough. Second question I've got relates to fees and charges. Building application fees 40k below year-to-date budget, which makes for an interesting correlation between development fees and building applications. They don't seem to follow because development applications are on the increase. Well, that's an observation or anything you can attend to. Have we historically seen building applications following the development applications, or
it's something I have to take on notice and actually have a discussion.
I just thought that was an interesting correlation. That one's up and the other's down. I would have thought one would have followed the other.
Obviously included in the building.
Normally they do, Joe. My experience is they normally do. There is a direct correlation.
Well, that's my normal. That's why.
In fact, there's often a bit of a lag. Yeah, the lag is you get the planning applications first, and the building comes second, and then it carries over the other way.
Would have assumed to some degree there's a lag, but to see it 40 as significantly behind as that when we've been having a constant flow of above budget building development applications coming through. I was surprised to see that figure, so it'd be interesting to do a little bit of analysis and see if there's any logic behind that or whether that's a consistency. Interest received. Comment. Interest on overdue rates and charges 54k above year-to-date budget. I said an indication of hard time for some with the level of overdue rates. Are our overdue rates at a level to be concerned about, or any more or less than normal?
If you have a look on page 23, the last graph there, that covers that.
23.
The rate arrears graph.
Yeah,
it's slightly up, but nothing
disturbing. So that was the question that came through as I was reading through it.
You have a fairly typical profile with those, depending on where the rates come into, people pay over time.
Investment revenue. Interesting to read. Investment revenue 50k above year-to-date budget, despite the fact that we're at record low interest rates. So, did we just budget conservatively? Or?
The first half of the year we still benefited from some of those term deposits that we had held for 12 months that we'd invested a year ago at a lovely 2.8% investment rate before the interest rates started in the markets started to drop. So I dare say now that we're going back out to the market and reinvesting this month, following the rate run, we'll find that the rates will be much.
So we would have budgeted fairly conservatively, knowing that low interest rates are on the card.
That's right. So we'll see that flow through over the next few months, Councillor.
If everybody will indulge, I've got a few more on the expenses side. Employee costs, probably one for the CEO. Under expenditure for permanent staff salaries and wages, 1.9 million, partially offset by additional spend on casual staff and external labour hire. Is that an indication of the length of time that positions are vacant?
I'm just getting it up just to do with it.
Page 18, top first item in page 18. Can we get that figure coming through a bit? Have we got long lags in staff vacancies?
We've had a couple, but nothing. No, not. I wouldn't say it was generally across the board. There are some targeted positions where we might have difficulty recruiting. I can think of one in our civil ops area, Cameron's old position. But generally, when we advertise, we're getting really good feels.
So how do we fill those vacancies when they're?
For lower level positions, they're advertised internally first. Otherwise, they're internally.
Yeah, but you know, for the length of time that they're, how do we fill the void while that position is being filled?
Well, take for the external staff. That's where the external labour hire comes in. That's why that's up. If someone's,
which you could do on some of those lower.
If you have two people in the truck, one's resigns and moves on, then you can get someone else in. And we do have a bit of a try before you buy policy as well, unofficial policy, where if you have an external staff member with a position vacant, we bring in a labour hire, and if they're any good, they tend to stay for a while and then end up applying for the job as well. If they're no good, we move them on.
Clearly more difficult with the upper level positions, so hence there's probably that lag, and that's...
Yeah, we've had a couple. I think you've had one where you've had to go out to
we have had some of the new initiatives, for example, some of the specialist positions we had adopted in the budget this year for new initiatives have unfortunately taken us a long time to find the right person. So whilst there's a gap in our resourcing, it's to feed a service level increase or to resolve a long-standing gap in our service level. So it's not like we've had other staff scrambling to cover those gaps in the short term.
And Joe, the advice I always give on that is that I'd rather take longer to get the right person than just take the first person. So we always
just understanding where that gap can
but in terms of attracting people, we've not had real problems with attracting people. Some of the particular sectors are difficult to make. Project management's a good example. There's a lot of infrastructure construction going around, and project managers are a pretty desirable commodity out there.
Again, for someone reading this that may not understand it, so then an opportunity to explain why some of those occur. Parks and Gardens operation and maintenance programs 108k below year-to-date budget. One would assume that this will jump and probably exceed if we continue with the wet weather.
Yes, that's the plan, as why the budget is intentionally sitting conservatively under budget.
Community property 75k below budget. I mean, we need to get on top of the maintenance of those. We've got a lot of older buildings. It's starting to at least one toilet block being upgraded, but a lot of others. So that's a concern that we start to get behind. And the Hastings Street maintenance levy 162k above year-to-date budget. I'm assuming that's due to timing of works prior to the peak holiday season, perhaps?
That's the new lighting installation, the contribution for new lighting installation on Hastings Street is the primary driver for that.
And the reserve that it's funded from, is that the Hastings Street reserve?
Correct.
The only other question I think I've got relates to total cash on hand at the end was 62 million, including funds held in trust for restricted purposes. I thought we had asked for breakdowns on these figures to see what is and isn't restricted in future reports, not just the overall.
Do apologise. I'll make sure I remedy that for the future reports. So.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought we had.
If I missed it.
But it might be an interesting one to just break up.
Can I suggest we do that at the end of each quarter rather than monthly?
Yeah, that's it.
Makes sense.
Sure. At least at some period that we see what has and hasn't. So we can also see the movement. We can also see the movement there. Yeah. Okay. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I think the councillors have got any questions.
Happy to move it.
Moved Councillor Wellington.
I'll second it.
Seconded Councillor Jackson.
Sorry, I do have one more question. My apologies. Going down into your attachment 1, the statement of income and expenditure. Contributed assets 6% of budget. It's a $10 million current budget item. Why?
I can elaborate.
Why contributed assets at such a low level?
So the contributed assets are those assets that we take on maintenance after a subdivision is finalised. So it's roads or stormwater pipeline. Ultimately, it comes down to the timing of when that subdivision plan is sealed and the assets come on maintenance. So what we found so far is we had a lot of the subdivisions, for example, some of the ones in the hinterland towns. Those stagings of the subdivisions came on maintenance last year.
Greenwood Grove, I assume, would be the main one.
Yep. And what we found so far this year is we haven't hit that trigger point with some of those subdivisions where it's come on maintenance. and the assets have come across to us at this point in time.
Yeah, just surprised to see a figure of 6% in the budget that's over halfway through the financial year, so that's fine.
And the $2 million is a year-on-year estimate. We don't know the speed or the
so it's not a
staging
specific.
of specific which those developments are coming through.
That's all right. Thank you.
Speak to the motion, Councillor Wellington. Any other councillors wish to speak to the motion? Thank you for the comprehensive reporting, Trent. Good job. With the motion, those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you, Trent.
Thank you. Thanks, Trent.
That's the end of the